Chapter 19 of The Tale of Triona by William John Locke. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 19. Olivia struggled for a fortnight against circumstance, when circumstance got the upper hand. But it had been a valiant fight from the moment Mara, on her return to the flat, had delivered Triona's scribbled note, and had given her account of the brief parting interview. "It's just as well," she said. "It's the only way out." She made a brave show of dining, while Mara waited stoically. At last, impelled to speech, she said, "Well, what do you think of it?" "How can I think of what I know nothing about?" said Mara. "Would you like to know?" "My liking has nothing to do with it," said Mara, brushing the crumbs off the table. "If you tell me because it may help you. But I know it's not a Christian thing to say. I'm not likely to forgive the man that has done you an injury." "He's done me no injury," said Olivia. "That's what I want you to know. No injury in the ordinary sense of the word." She looked up at Mara's impassive face, and met the dull blue eyes, and found it very difficult to tell her in spite of lifelong intimacy. Yet it was right that Mara should have no false notions. "I've discovered that my husband's name is not Alexis Triona. It is John Briggs." "John Briggs," echoed Mara. "His father was a labourer in Newcastle. He was a chauffeur in Russia. All that he had said about himself and written in his book is untrue. When he left us last summer to go to Finland, he really went to Newcastle to his mother's deathbed. Everything he has told me has been a lie from beginning to end. Oh, God, Mara!" She broke down and clutched her face, while her throat was choking with dry sobbing. Mara came swiftly round the table and put her arm around her and drew the beloved head near to her thin body. There, my dear, you can tell me more another time." Olivia let herself be soothed for a while. Then she pulled herself together and rose. "No, I'll tell you everything now. Then we'll never need talk of it again. I'm not going to make a fool of myself." She stiffened herself against feminine weakness. At the end of the story, Mara asked her, "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to carry on as if nothing had happened, at any rate for the present." Mara nodded slowly. "You're not the only one who's had to carry on as if nothing had happened." "What do you mean?" Olivia asked quickly. "Nothing but what I said," replied Mara. "Takes some doing, but you've got to believe in God and believe in yourself." "Where did you get your wisdom from, Mara?" asked Olivia wonderingly. "From life, my dear," replied Mara with unwonted softness. And, picking up the last tray of removed dinner things, she left the room. The next afternoon she said to Mara, "Major Olifant has telephoned me that Mr. Triona is arriving at Paddington by a 6:15 train. I should like you to come with me." "Very well," said Mara. It was characteristic of their relations that they spoke not a word of Triona during their drive to the station, or during their wait on the platform. When the train came in, and they had assured themselves that he had not arrived, for they had taken the precaution to separate and each to scan a half-section, they re-entered their waiting taxicab and drove home. "I hope I shall never see him again," said Olivia, humiliated by this new deception. "He told Major Olifant that he was coming straight to town by the train. The truth isn't in him. You mustn't suppose," she turned rather fiercely to Mara, "that I came to meet him with any idea of reconciliation. That's why I brought you with me. But people don't part for ever in this hysterical way. There are decencies of life. There are the commonplace arrangements of a separation." She burned with a new sense of wrong. Once more he had eluded her. Now what she told Mara was true. She wished never to see him again. Blaise Olifant came up to town, anxious to be of service, and found her in this defiant mood. "It's impossible for it all to end like this," he said. "You are wounded to the quick. He's in a state of crazy remorse. Time will soften things. He'll come to his senses and return and ask your forgiveness, and you will give it." She replied, "My dear Blaise, you don't understand. The man I loved and married doesn't exist." "The man of genius exists. Listen," he said. "After he left me, I've done scarcely anything but think of the two of you. He could have put forward a case, a very strong case, but he didn't." "And what was his strong case?" she asked bitterly. Olifant put before her his reasoned apologia for the life of Triona. Given the first deception practised under the obsession of the little black book acting on a peculiarly sensitive temperament, the rest followed remorselessly. He was being blackmailed by one lie. "My intelligence grasps what you say," Olivia answered, "but my heart doesn't. You're standing away and can see things in the round. I'm in the middle of them, and I can't." If she, although his wife, had stood away, if she had been dissociated from his deceptions, if nothing more had occurred than the exposure of the Triona myth, she might have forgiven him. But the deceptions had been interwoven with the sacred threads of her love. She could not forgive that intimate entanglement. To a woman the little things are as children, as the little ones whose offenders Christ cursed with the millstone and the sea. She had lain awake, his forgotten wristwatch on her arm, picturing him tossed by the waves of the North Sea in the execution of her country's errand. She had proudly told 100 people of the Bolshevist gyve marks around his ankle. She had been moved to her depths by the tragical romance of the fictitious Vronsky. In her heart there had been hot rebellion against a Foreign Office keeping stranglehold on a heroic servant and restricting his freedom of action. These little sufferings he had caused her she could not forgive. While inflicting them he knew that she suffered. In vain did Olifant, unversed in the psychology of woman, plead the cause of the erratic creature that was her husband. In vain did he set out his honourable and uncontested record, that of a man whose response to the call of duty was unquestioned, of whose courage and endurance she had received personal testimony, who had cheerfully suffered wounds, the hardships of flight through revolutionary Russia, the existence on a minesweeper on perilous seas ending in the daily dreaded catastrophe. The record of a man who, apart from his fraud, had justified himself as a queer, imaginative genius, writing of life in a new way, in a new vibrating style that had compelled the attention of the English-speaking world. In vain did he adduce the boyish charm of the man. Olivia sighed. "I don't know him as you see him," she said. "Then what can I do?" he answered. She shook a despairing head. "Nothing, my dear Blaise." She rubbed the palm of one hand on the back of the other, and turned her great dark eyes on him. "You can't do anything, but you've done something. You show me how loyal a man can be." He protested vaguely. "My dear Olivia." "It's true," she said, "and I'll always remember it. And now don't let us ever talk about this again." "As you will," said he. "But what are you going to do?" She replied as she had done to Myra. She would carry on. "Until when?" She shrugged her shoulders. She would carry on indefinitely. To act otherwise would open the door to gossip. She was not going to be done to death by slanderous tongues. She rose and stood before him in slim, rigid dignity. "If I can't outbrave the world, I'm a poor thing." "You stay here, then?" he asked. "Why not? Where else should I go?" "I came with a little note from my sister," said Olifant, drawing a letter from his pocket and handing it to her. Olivia read it through. Then she said in a softened voice, "You're a dear, kind friend." "It's my sister," he smiled, but he could not keep an appeal out of his eyes. "Why shouldn't you?" he asked suddenly. "It would be hateful for you here, for all your courage. And you'll be fighting what? Just shadows, and you'll expend all your strength in it. What good would it do you, or anybody? You want rest, real rest, of body and soul." She met his eyes. "Do I look so woebegone?" "The sight of you now is enough to break the heart of anyone who cares for you, Olivia," he said soberly. "It's merely a question of sleeplessness. That'll pass off." "It will pass off quicker in the country," he urged. "It will be a break. The house will be yours. Mary and I the discreetest shadows. You don't know the self-effacing dear that Mary is. Besides, she is one of these women who is a living balm for the wounded. To look at her is to draw love and comforting from her." He ventured the tips of his fingers on her slender shoulders. "Do come. Your old room shall be yours just as you left it, or the room I have always kept sacred." She stood by the fireplace, her arm on the mantel-shelf, looking away from him. "Or if you like," he went on, We'll clear out. We only want a few days, and give you back your old home, all to yourself. She stretched out a groping hand. He took it. I know you would, she said. It's beautiful of you. I'm not surprised because... She swayed head and shoulders a bit, seeking for words, her eyes away from him. Because, after that first day at Medlow, I've never thought of you as doing otherwise than that what was beautiful and noble. It sounds silly, but I mean it. She withdrew her hand and walked away into the room, her back towards him. He strode after her. That's foolishness. I'm only an ordinary, decent sort of man. In the circumstances, good Lord, I couldn't do less. She faced him in the middle of the room. And I, as an ordinary, decent woman, couldn't do less than what I've said. Well, said he. They stood for a few seconds eye to eye. A faint colour came into her cheeks, and she smiled. Don't suppose I'm not tempted. I am. But if I came, you'd spoil me. I've got to fight. This valiant attitude he could not induce her to abandon. At last, with a pathetic air of disappointment, he said, If I can help you in any other way, and you won't let me, I shall be hurt. Oh, I'll let you, she cried impulsively. You may be sure. Who else is there? He went away, comforted. Yet he did not return to Medlow. These early days, he argued, were critical. Anything might happen, and it would be well for him to remain within call. Of what the future held for her she did not think. Her mind was concentrated on the struggle through the present. She received a woman caller and chattered over tea as though nothing had happened. The effort braced her, and she felt triumphant over herself. She went about on her trivial shopping. She remembered a fitting for a coat and skirt which she had resolved to postpone till after the projected motor jaunt. If she was to live in the world, she must have clothes to cover her. One morning, therefore, she journeyed to the dressmaker's in Hanover Street, and, the fitting over, wandered through the square, down Conduit Street into Bond Street. At the corner she ran into Lydia, expensively dressed, creamy, serene. "My dear, you're looking like a ghost. What have you been doing with yourself?" "Jogging on as usual," said Olivia. Their acquaintance had not been entirely broken. A few calls had been exchanged. Once Lydia had lunched with Olivia alone in the Buckingham Palace Road, but they had not met since the early part of the year. They strolled slowly down Bond Street. Lydia was full of news. Bobby Quinton had married Mrs. Bellingham, a rich woman twice his age. "The way of the transgressor is soft," said Olivia. Modegard was transferred to Rome. His idol, the Russian dancer, had run off with Ganymede, the fitter at Lancoise. Hadn't Olivia heard? "Where have you been living, my dear child? In a tomb? It has been the talk of London for the past 6 weeks. They're in Paris now, and they say she lies down on the floor and lets the little beast kick her. She likes it. No account for tastes. Perhaps that's why she left Modegard." In her serene, worldly way, she went through the scandalous chronicles of her galley. She came at last to Edwin Mavenna. Olivia remembered Mavenna? She laughed indulgently. Olivia shuddered at the memory and gripped her hands tight. Mavenna, he mattered little. A beast let loose for a few moments from the darkness. He was eclipsed from her vision by the boyish, grey-clad figure in the moonlight. She scarcely heard Lydia's chatter. "One must live and let live, you know, in this world. He and Sidney are partners now. I hinted something of the sort at the time. You don't mind now, do you?" "Not a bit. Why should I?" said Olivia. "That's really why I'm not asked you down to our place in Sussex. But if you don't mind meeting him, he's quite a good sport, really." Olivia's eyes wandered up and down the crowded roadway. "Wish I could see an empty taxi," she said. She had a sudden horror of Lydia, a horror queerly mingled with fierce jealousy. Why should Lydia, with her gross materialism, be leading this unruffled existence? "Are you in a hurry?" Lydia asked placidly. "I've an appointment with my dentist." "We'll get in here and wait until we see a taxi," said Lydia. They stood in the recess of a private doorway, by the bow window of a print shop. "You're not looking well, my dear," said Lydia, quite affectionately. "Marriage doesn't seem to agree with you." "What's the matter?" Olivia flashed. "Nothing's the matter." "How's your husband?" "Very well." This was intolerable. She strained her eyes for the little red flag of freedom. Then, as she had told her visitor of a day or two before, "He's gone abroad on important business." "And not taken you with him?" "His business isn't ordinary business," she said instinctively. Then she recognized she was covering him with his own cloak. Her pale cheeks flushed. "So that's it," said Lydia, smiling. "You're a poor little grass widow. You want bucking up, my dear. Bit of old times. Come and do a dinner and a theatre with us. Sidney would love to see you again. We'll steer clear of naughty old Malvena." She had to stop, for Olivia had rushed across the pavement and was holding up her little embroidered bag at arm's length, and the heaven-sent taxi was drawing up to the curb. Lydia followed her and stood while she entered the cab. "You'll come, won't you, dear?" "I'll telephone," said Olivia. She put out a hand. "Good-bye. It's been so pleasant seeing you again." Lydia shook hands and smiled in her prosperous, contented way. Then she said, "Where shall he drive to?" Olivia had not given the matter a thought. She reflected swiftly. If she said home, Lydia would suspect her eagerness to escape. After all, she didn't want to hurt Lydia's feelings. She cried at random, "Marlborough Road, St. John's Wood." "What a funny place for a dentist to live," said Lydia. Anyhow, it was over. She was alone in the taxi, which was proceeding northwards up Bond Street. Of all people in the world, Lydia was the one she least had desired to meet. Dinner and review, possibly supper and a dance afterwards. Back again to where she had started little over a year ago. She suddenly became aware of herself shrieking with laughter. In horror she stopped short, and felt a clattering shock all through her frame, like a car going at high speed, when, at the instant of danger, all the brakes are suddenly applied. She lay back on the cushions, panting. Her brow was moist. She put up her hand and found a wisp of hair sticking to her temples. The cab went on. Where was she? Where was she going? She looked out of the window and recognized Regent's Park. Then she remembered her wildly given destination. She put her head through the window. "I've changed my mind," she said to the driver. "Go to Buckingham Palace Mansions." The next morning came a letter from Lydia on expensive primrose notepaper. Would Friday be convenient? Sidney and herself would call for her at 7. There was a postscript. "I hope the St. John's Wood dentist didn't hurt you too much." It gave her an idea. She replied, "So sorry, the St. John's Wood dentist has made it impossible for me to appear in public for at least a month." She checked an impulse of laughter. She must keep hold on herself. Olifant came in the afternoon. She told him of a communication she had received from her bank to the effect that Alexis had placed a large sum of money to her account. But she did not tell him of her meeting with Lydia. "What's to be done with the money? I don't want it. It had better be retransferred." "I'll see what I can do," said Olifant. He came back next morning. He'd seen the manager of Triona's bank. Nothing could be done. Alexis had drawn out his balance in cash and closed his account. "Let things be, at any rate for the present," Olifant counselled. When he took his leave, he said, looking down on her from his lean height, "I do wish she would come to Medlow." She knew that she was ill. She knew that she was looking ill. But her little frame shook with an impatient movement. "I'm going to stick it, Blaise. I'm going to stick it if I die for it." "It's magnificent, but it isn't war, or anything else," said he. Then came Rowington, the last straw, in the guise of an anxious, kindly, gold-spectacled, clean-shaven, florid-faced philanthropist. First he had asked over the telephone for Triona's address, an urgent matter. Olivia replied that his address was secret. Would she kindly forward a letter? She replied that none of her husband's letters were to be forwarded. Would Mrs. Triona see him then? He would wait on her at any time convenient to her. She fixed the hour. He came on the stroke. Olivia, her heart cold, her brain numbed by 100 apprehensions, was waiting for him in the drawing-room. Mara announced him. Olivia rose. "My dear Mrs. Triona," said he, emphasizing the conventional handshake by laying his hand over hers and holding it. "Where is that wonderful husband of yours?" "He's gone abroad," said Olivia. "He must come back," said Rowington. "He's gone away for a long time on important business," said Olivia, parrot-wise. She motioned him to a chair. They sat down. "I gathered something of the sort from his letter. Has he told you of certain dispositions?" She fenced. "I don't quite follow you." "This letter?" He handed her the letter of instructions with regard to payment of royalties which he had received from Triona. She glanced through it. "That's all right," she said. He drew a breath of relief. "I'm glad you know. I had a sort of idea. Anyhow, no matter how important his business is, it's essential that he should come back at once." "Why?" she asked. But she had a sickening prescience of the answer. The kindly gentleman passed his hand over his forehead. "It's just a business complication, my dear Mrs. Triona," he said. She rose. He, too, courteously. "Is it to do with anything that happened on the night of your dinner party?" "I'm afraid so." "Colonel Onslow and Captain Wedderburn?" He met her eyes. "Yes," said he. "They've come to you with all sorts of lies about Alexis?" "I would give 10 years of my life not to wound you, Mrs. Triona," he said in great distress. "I didn't sleep a wink last night. My honour as a publisher is involved, but let that pass. I'm thinking more of you. You only can help me, and your husband. These two gentlemen have come to me with a challenge, your husband's good faith. They ask, is Through Blood and Snow a bona fide personal record?" "It is," said Olivia, with her back to the wall. "You'll have to prove it." "He will," said Olivia proudly. "What do they propose to do?" "Have the whole thing cleared up in public, in the press. My dear Mrs. Triona," he said, after a few moments' hesitation, "don't you see the false position I'm in? This letter I've shown you, it looks like running away. Forgive me if I wound you. But on the face of it, it does. I daren't tell them. But of course, if Mr. Triona comes back, he'll be able to give all the explanation in the world. I haven't the remotest doubt of it, not the remotest doubt. So, whatever his business is, you must recall him. You see the importance?" "Yes, I see," said Olivia tonelessly. "So will you write and tell him this?" The truth had to come out, she said. "As a matter of fact, I don't know where he is. I can't communicate with him." She hated the look of incredulous surmise on Warrington's face. "As soon as I can, I'll let him know." Yes, said Warrington. "You must. You see, don't you, that both Onslow and Wedderburn feel it to be in their public duty?" "But they're both men of decent feeling," said Olivia. "They wouldn't attack a man when they knew he wasn't here to defend himself." "I hope not, my dear Mrs. Triona," said Warrington. "I sincerely hope not. I'll see them again. Indeed, I tried to put them off the whole thing. I did my best." "What's the exact charge they make against my husband?" To her utmost power she would defend him. Let her know the facts. He explained. There was a mysterious period of 10 months. Captain Wedderburn asserted that for 4 of those months her husband was with the armoured column, and for the remaining 6 he lay wounded in a Russian hospital. Colonel Onslow maintained that those 10 months, he had his dates exact, are covered in the book by Alexis Triona's adventures in farthest Russia, and that these adventures are identical with those of another man who related them to him in person. "That's definite at any rate," said Olivia. "But it's a monstrous absurdity all the same. My husband denied the Russian hospital in my presence. You can tell these gentlemen that what they propose to do is infamous, especially when they learn he is not here. Will you give them my message? To hit a man behind his back is not English." Rowington saw burning eyes in a dead white face, and a slim dark figure drawn up tragically tense. He went home miserably with this picture in his mind. For all her bravery, she had not restored his drooping faith in Triona. And Olivia sat, when he had left her, staring at public disgrace. Against that she could not fight. The man she had loved was a shadow, a non-existent thing. But she bore his name. She had sworn to keep right the honour of the name before the world. And now the world would sweep it into the dustbin of ignominy. A maddening sense of helplessness, growing into a great terror, got possession of her. The next morning, when Mara brought in her letters, she felt ill and feverish after a restless night. One of the envelopes bore Triona's familiar handwriting. She seized it eagerly. It would give some address, so that she could summon him back to make a fight for his honour. But there was no address. She read it through, and then broke into shrill, harsh laughter. "He says he's going out this morning to fight for the sacred cause of Poland." Mara, who was pottering about the room, turned on her sharply. As soon as Olivia was quieter, she sent for the doctor. Later in the day there came a nurse, and Mara was banished most of the day from the beloved bedside. Thus it came about that the next morning no correspondence or morning papers were brought into Olivia's room. And that is why Mara, who preferred the chatty paragraphs to leaders and political news, said nothing to her mistress of a paragraph stuck away in the corner of the paper. It was only a few lines, issued by the police, though Mara did not know that, to the effect that a well-dressed man with papers on him giving the name of John Briggs had been knocked over by a motor lorry the previous morning and had been taken unconscious to University College Hospital. End of chapter 19. Chapter 20 of The Tale of Triona by William John Locke. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 20. Mara stood by the screened-off bed in the long ward and looked unemotionally at the unconscious man. "Yes," she said to the sister, "that is Mr. John Briggs. I know him intimately." "Are you a relative?" "He has no relatives." "You see, in a case like this we have to report to the police. It's their business to find somebody responsible." "I'm responsible," said Mara. The sister looked at the tall, lean woman, so dignified in her well-made iron grey coat and skirt and plain black hat, and was puzzled to place her socially. She might be an austere lady of high degree. On the other hand, she spoke with an odd country accent. It was at any rate 999 to 1 that she was a genuine friend of the patient, but there was the remaining 1 in 1,000 that she belonged to the race of cranks not unfamiliar in London hospitals. "It's only a matter of formality," said the sister, "but one must have some proof." So Mara drew her bow at a venture. "Mr. Briggs was going abroad, to Poland." The sister smiled with relief. In his pocket-book had been found railway tickets and unsealed letters to people in Prague and Warsaw. So long as they found someone responsible, it was all that mattered. She proceeded to explain the case. A broken thigh, broken ribs, and severe concussion. Possibly internal injuries, the surgeon couldn't tell yet. Mara scanned again the peaked bit of face beneath the head bandages, which was all that was visible of Alexis Triona, and asked, "Can he live?" "It's doubtful," said the sister. They moved away to the centre of the ward aisle. The sister talked of the accident, of the patient's position. "He's a rich man," said Mara. "So we gathered," replied the sister, who had in her keeping his pocket-book stuffed with English banknotes of high value. "If anything should happen, you of course will let me know." "Your name and address?" She gave it. The sister wrote it down on a notepad. "Could I see him just once more?" Mara asked. "Certainly." They went round the screen. Mara stood looking down on the bit she could see of the man who had brought catastrophe on her beloved. The shock of recognition, although expected, aroused her pity. Then her heart surged with fierce resentment. Serve the lying rascal right. Why hadn't the motor lorry finished the business right away? For all her cultivated impassivity of demeanour, she stood trembling by the bedside, scarcely knowing whether she wished him to die or live. Had he crossed her path unrelated to Olivia, she would have succumbed to his boyish charm. He had ever been courteous, grasping with his subtle tact the nature of the bond between her mistress and herself. So she half loved, half loathed him. And yet, all this considered, it would be better for Olivia and for himself if he were to die. She glanced swiftly around. The sister had been called away for a second. She was alone behind the screen. She knew that if she could take that bandaged head in her gloved hands and shake it, he would die, and Olivia would be free. She shivered at the extraordinary temptation. Then reaction came and sped her from his side. She met the sister. "Can I come again to see how he's getting on?" "By all means." "I shouldn't like him to die," said Mara. Said the sister, somewhat mystified at this negative pronouncement. "You may be sure we'll do all that we can." "I know," said Mara. Of these proceedings and of these conflicting emotions she said nothing to Olivia, nor did she say anything of subsequent visits to the hospital where Triona still lay unconscious. In a short time Olivia recovered sufficiently to dispense with the nurse. The doctor prescribed change of air. Olifant once more suggested Medlow, and this time she yielded. But on the afternoon before her departure, while they were packing, she had a strange conversation with Mara. She held in her hand, uncertain whether to burn it, the last wild letter of Alexis. "I'm glad he's gone to Poland," she said reflectively. "Why?" asked Mara, not looking up from the trunk by which she was kneeling. "It's a man's work, after all," said Olivia. "So's digging potatoes." "I suppose you're right," said Olivia. She tore up the letter and threw the fragments into the fire. "What a hell marriage can be!" "It can," said Mara. "You're lucky you've escaped." "Have I?" asked Mara, intent on the packing of underwear. At her tone Olivia started. "What do you mean?" Mara looked up, sitting back on her heels. "Do you suppose, dearie, you're the only woman in trouble in the world?" Olivia moved a step towards her. "Are you too in trouble, Mara?" "I've been in trouble for the last 20 years, ever since I left your mother's house to be married to him." Olivia stared at her open-mouthed, lost in amazement. This prim, puritanical, predestined spinster of a Mara. "You married?" She swerved back into a chair, reeling ever so little under this new shock. If there had been one indubitable, solid fact in her world, one that had stood out absolute during all the disillusions of the past year, it was Mara's implacable spinsterhood. Why, she'd seen Mara every day of her life, ever since she could remember, except for the annual holiday. Yes, those holidays always a subject for jest with her father and brothers when they were alive. No one had known whether she had gone or when she had emerged on her reappearance. She had never given an address, so far as Olivia knew, and yet her plunge into the unknown had received the unquestioned acceptance of the family. Only last November she had gone in her mysterious way, taking, however, only a fortnight instead of her customary month. Olivia, heaven knew why, had formed the careless impression that she had betaken herself to some tabby-like home for religious incurables, run by her dissenting organisation. And all this time, tabby-like in another sense, she had been stealing back to her husband. Where was truth in the world? She repeated mechanically, "You married?" Mara rose stiffly, her joints creaking, and stood before her mistress, and perhaps for the first time in her life Olivia saw a gleam of light in the elderly woman's expressionless pale blue eyes. "Yes, I'm married. Before the end of my honeymoon I found he wasn't in his right mind. I had to shut him up and come back to your mother. He's alive still, in the county asylum. I go to see him every year." In a revulsion of feeling, Olivia sprang to her feet and held out both her arms. "Mara, my dear old Mara!" Mara suffered the young embrace, and then gently disengaged herself. "There, there," she said. "Why have you never told me?" "Would it have done you any good?" "It would have made me much more thoughtful and considerate." "I've never wanted thought or consideration," said Mara. "You have. So I say, would it have done you any good? Not a ha'porth. I'd be much more used to you as I am. If you want to serve people, don't go and throw your private life down their throats. It chokes them. You may think it won't, but it does." "But why?" asked Olivia, with moist eyes. "Why should you want to serve me like that? Your devotion all these years." "My duty," said Mara. "I told you something of the sort a while ago. What's the good of repeating things? Besides, there was your mother." "Did mother know?" Mara nodded. "She didn't know I was going to be married. I was young then, and afraid. Madam took me out of an orphanage, and I thought I was bound for life. He came to Medlow to do thatching. That's how I met him. His father, one of a large family, had come from Norfolk to settle in the West. The Norfolk thatchers are known all over England. Goes down from father to son. His family had been thatchers in the same village since the Norman Conquest. He was a fine, upstanding man, and in his way an aristocrat, different from the butcher's boys and baker's men that came to the back door. I loved him with all my heart. He asked me to marry him. I said yes. We arranged it should be for my next holiday. Up to then I'd spent my holiday at a seaside place connected with the orphanage. One paid a trifle. Instead of going there, I went to his home. It was only when the trouble came that I wrote to your mother. She said the fewer people who knew, the better. I came back as though nothing had happened. Whether she told Mr. Gale or not, I don't know. I don't think she did. There was a baby, but thank God it was born dead. Your mother arranged it all so that no one should be the wiser. You yourself were the tiniest tot. Perhaps now you see why I have a duty towards the daughter of an angel from heaven. And all my life, Olivia began, but Myra interrupted her unemotionally. I didn't tell you any of this because, as I said, it could do you no good. And it's your good I've lived for. One must have something to live for anyway. Some folks live for food, other folks live for religion. I'd have lived for religion if it wasn't for you. I've struggled and prayed to find the way. Often it has been a question of you and Jesus Christ who has called me to forsake the vain affections of this world. And I've chosen you. I may be damned in hell for it, but I don't care. She went on her knees again by the trunk and continued to pack dainty underwear. I've told you now because it may do you good to see that you're not the only married woman in trouble. I'd thank you, she added after a pause, to leave me alone with this packing. And as Olivia, not daring to yield the fullness of her heart to this strange, impassive creature, lingered by the door, Myra said, "You'd best go now, dearie, and think it out. At any rate, you haven't got to go through the sorrow of the baby business." Whether this was consolation or not, Olivia could not decide. If there had been a child, and it had lived, it might have been a comfort and a blessing. Nothing in its heredity would have marked it with a curse. But still it would have been a lifelong link with the corporeal man whom she had not married, from whom she shrank, and whom she proclaimed her desire never to see again. On the other hand, Myra's revelation gave her strength and restored her courage. She shuddered at the thought of the hopeless lunatic in the county asylum, dragging out dead years of life. At any rate, she was married to a living man. Her first days in Medlow passed like a dream. The kindest and gentlest of women, Mary Woolcombe, Olifant's sister, ministered to her wants. Mrs. Woolcombe, too, had made an unhappy marriage, and now lived apart from her husband, the depraved Oxford Don. Thus, with her hostess and Myra, Olivia found herself within a little freemasonry of unsuccessful wives. And one day, when she came to think of it, she laughed out loud. "We might start a home," she said to Myra. It was only later, when she shook off the strangeness of the dearly familiar, and grew strong enough to venture out into the streets, that she found a sense of perspective. Not so long ago had she set out on her great adventure, only 18 months. Yet in these she had gathered the experience of 18 years. Save for Blaise Olifant's study, the house was little changed. The oak settle in the hall still showed the marks of the teeth of Barabbas, the bull-terrier pup. The white pane in the blue and red window of the bathroom still accused the youthful Bobby, now asleep forever beneath the sod of Picardy. Her own old room, used by Mrs. Woolcombe, was practically unaltered. She stared into it as she rambled about the house, and felt that she had done right in not dispossessing its present occupant. All her girlhood was contained within those 4 walls, and she could not go back to it. The room would be haunted by its inconsiderable ghosts. She preferred her mother's room, which, though scrupulously kept aired and dusted, had remained under lock and key. There, if ghosts counted for aught, would a spirit pervade of exquisite sympathy. As Olifant had promised, she found herself in a strange, indefinable way again mistress of the house, although she could take no part in its practical direction. He had spoken truth of his sister, whom she loved at first sight. Mary Wilcombe was plump, rosy, and brown-haired, with her brother's dark blue eyes. On their first evening leave-taking, Olivia had been impelled to kiss her, and had felt the responsive warmth of a sisterly bosom. "I do hope you feel at home," Olifant asked her one day after lunch. "You seem like guests, not hosts," replied Olivia. "It's dear of you to say so," said Mary Wilcombe, "but I wish you'd prove it by asking your friends to come and see you." "I will," replied Olivia. But she flushed scarlet, and as soon as she was alone she grappled with realities. And realities nearly always have a nasty element of the ironical. She remembered the first cloud that swept over her serene soul during the honeymoon bliss of the Point. They had discussed their future domicile. Alexis had suggested the common-sense solution, the Towers as headquarters. She, with the schoolgirl stigma of Lansdowne House upon her, and possessed by the bitter memory of the nose-in-the-air attitude of the Blair Park crocodile, eternal symbol of social status, had revolted at the suggestion. He, the equal and companion of princes, looked on her, and if his last crazy letter signified anything, looked still on her as the high-born lady, the princess of his dreams. Each therefore had deceived the other. She, the daughter of Gale and Trivett, auctioneers and estate agents, and so by the unwritten law cut off from the gentry of Medlow, had undergone agony of remorse for the sake of the son of a Tyneside operative, a boy before the mast, a common chauffeur, a man far her inferior in the social scale. No wonder he could not understand her hesitancies. Her resentment against him blazed anew. For his sake she had needlessly soiled her soul with deceit and snobbery. It was well that he had passed out of her life. "May I invite Mr. Trivett and Mr. Fenmarch to tea?" she asked. Mary Wilcombe smiled. "The house is yours, dear. That's not a Spanish courtesy, but an English fact." So the two old gentlemen came, and Olivia entertained them in the dining-room, as she had done on the afternoon of her emancipation. She sat at the end of the comfortably laid table, and the dusty Fenmarch, with the face of an old moulting badger, drank tea, while as before the stout red-gilled Trivett drank whisky and soda with his hot scones. This time the latter explained that the whisky was a treat, forbidden by Mrs. Trivett at the domestic tea-table. They welcomed her back in the kindness of their simple hearts. They knew nothing of her separation from Triona. She had been ill and come down for rest and change. "And you look as if you need it, my dear," said Mr. Trivett, "and some of your good father's old port. There should still be a dozen or two of Coburn's 70 in the cellar at the present moment, unless Major Olifant has drunk it all." Olivia laughed, for it was humorously meant. Mr. Fenmarch, in the act of raising his teacup to his lips, put it down again with a sigh, and shook his dusty head. "It was a great wine," he said, with a look backward into the past. "We'll have a bottle up," cried Olivia. In spite of polite protests, she rang for Mara, and to Mara she gave instructions. And presently Mara, trained from girlhood in the nice conduct of wine, appeared with the cobwebbed bottle, white splash uppermost, tenderly tilted in unshaking hands. Trivett took it from her reverently, while she sought corkscrew and napkin and glasses, and when she placed the napkin pad on the table, and Trivett took the corkscrew, Fenmarch, with the air of one participating in a holy rite, laid both hands on the sacred bottle and watched the extraction of the cork as one who waits the manifestation of the god. The brows of both men were bent, and they held their breaths. Then the cork came out clear and true, and the broad red face of Trivett was irradiated by an all-pervading smile. It faded into an instant's seriousness while he smelled the cork. It reappeared triumphant as he held the corkscrew, with cork impaled, beneath the nostrils of Fenmarch. Fenmarch sniffed and smiled and bowed. "Olivia, my dear," said Trivett with a gesture. Olivia, understanding, held the wine-glasses. The wine flowed clear, gold dissolved in rubies. Is there a colour on earth like the colour of old port? "Stop, only a sip for me," she laughed. "Nonsense, it was only for the sake of her health that we let her open it. Eh, Fenmarch?" But Fenmarch, eager on the pouring, cried, "Don't move your glass, for God's sake, Olivia. You'll waste it." But Trivett, with a false air of chivalry, let her off with half a glass. Fenmarch refolded the napkin so as to give the temporarily abandoned bottle a higher tilt. The two men smelled the wine. For the first time since the awful night of disillusion, Olivia felt happy. These old dears! It was like stuffing greedy children with chocolates. The two elderly gentlemen raised their glasses and bowed to her, then sipped. "Ah," said Fenmarch. Said Trivett, with the knitted brow of puzzlement. Then suddenly the grey, badgery little man, who had never been known to laugh violently, gave Olivia the shock of her life. He thrust his chair from the table and smacked his thigh, and exploded in a high-pitched cackle of hilarity. "He can't taste it. He's been drinking whisky. He has paralysed his palate. I've been waiting for it." He beat the air with his hands. "Oh, Lord, that's good." Trivett's fat jowl fell. He gasped, regardless of Olivia. "So I have." "Moral," cried the delighted Fenmarch, "never try to steal a march on your wife. Doesn't pay, my boy. It doesn't pay." And he inhaled the aroma of the heaven-given wine, and drank with the serenity of the man who has never offended the high gods. Olivia, anxious to console, said to Mr. Trivett, "I'll send you some round to-morrow." Trivett spread out his great arms. "My dear, it'll have to settle. If moved, it won't be fit to drink for a couple of months." Eventually he reconciled himself to the loss of the subtler shades of flavour, and he shared with Fenmarch the drinkable remainder of the carefully handled bottle. But it was not for this genial orgy that Olivia had convened the meeting. "I owe you two dears an apology," she said. They protested an impossibility. "I do," she asserted. "The last time you were here you gave me good advice, which I rejected like a little fool. I insisted on going up to London with all my money tied up in a bundle to seek my fortune." "Well, my dear," said Trivett, "haven't you found it?" She looked from one to the other, and their wine-cheered faces grew serious as she slowly shook her head. "I wanted to tell you something in confidence. It mustn't get round the town, at any rate not yet. My husband and I aren't going to live together any more." "God bless my soul," said Fenmarch. "So," she continued, "I'm where I was when I left you, and I don't want any more adventures. And if you take back my bag of gold, there isn't so much in it now, and advise me what to do with it, I should be very grateful." It had cost her some sacrifice of pride to make this little speech. She had rehearsed it, put it off and off during the pleasant wine-drinking. She had flouted them once for two unimaginative agents, and now dreaded the possible grudge they might have against her. "If you'd only listened to us," they might say, with ill-concealed triumph. If they had done so, she would have accepted it as punishment for her overbearing conceit and for her snobbery. But they received her news with a consternation so affectionate and so genuine that her eyes filled with tears. "You won't ask me why," she said. "It's a complicated story, and painful, but it has nothing whatever to do with things people are divorced for. I should like you to understand that." "Then surely," said the old lawyer, "as the usual barrier to reconciliation doesn't exist, there may still be hopes." "None," said Olivia. "My husband has done the right thing. He has gone away, abroad, forever, and has made it impossible for me to find out his address." "My dear," said Mr. Trivett, his red face growing redder, "I don't want to know none of your private affairs." He lost hold of grammar sometimes when deeply moved. "It's enough for me that you're in trouble. I've known you ever since you were born, and I loved your father, who was the honestest man God ever made." He stretched out his great sun-glazed hand. "And so, if old Luke Trivett's any good to you, my dear, you can count on him as long as he's this side of the daisies." "And I'm your good friend too," said Mr. Fenmarch in his dustiest manner. When they had gone, Olivia sat for a long while alone in the dining-room, and she felt as though she had returned to the strong and dear realities of life after a feverish wandering among shadows. End of chapter 20. Chapter 21 of The Tale of Triona by William John Locke. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 21. After this, Olivia took up her life, as she thought, in firm hands. She had made her reparation to her old friends. She joined the family party of the Trivets at dinner, and mixed with the homely folk that assembled around old John Freke's tea-table. She lived in a glow of contrition for past snobberies. The vague story of her separation from Triona, which she had told to the two old men, not sufficing Medlow curiosity, she told what she believed to be the truth. "My husband has gone to Poland to fight against the Russian Reds," and thereby she gave the impression that the cause of the break-up of her married life was the incurable adventurous spirit of her husband. The suggestion fitted in with the town's idea of the romance of her marriage and the legendary character of Alexis Triona, which had originally been inspired by the local bookseller eager to sell copies of Triona's books. She herself therefore became invested in a gossamer garment of mystery, which she wore with becoming grace. Her homecoming was a triumph. As the days passed and brought no news of Alexis, she grew convinced of the honesty of his last letter. His real achievements in the past confirmed her conviction. He was the born adventurer. It was like him to have sought the only field of mad action open at that hour of frantically guarded peace. He had gone to Poland. In her heart she rejoiced. She saw him striving to burn a past record and rise phoenix-like from its ashes. "If he came back a Polish general all over stars and glory," said Myra, during one of their increasingly intimate conversations, "would you take up with him again?" Olivia reddened. "I should be glad for his sake." "I don't see that you're answering my question," said Myra. "I've told you once and for all," flashed Olivia, "that I'll have nothing more to do with him as long as I live." She meant it with all that she knew of her soul. His fraud was unforgivable. His perfect recognition of it constituted his only merit. In Poland, doing wild things, he was a picturesque and tolerable personage. In her immediate neighbourhood he became once again a repellent figure. As far as she could, she blotted him out of her thoughts. The threat of exposure at the hands of Onslow and Wedderburn still hung over her head. The disgrace of it would react on her innocent self. The laughter of the Lydian galley rang in her ears. She guessed the cynical gossip of the newer London world. That was hateful enough. She need never return to either, but it would follow her to Medlow. She would be pitied by the Trivets and the Freaks and the parents of the present generation of Lansdowne House. They would wonder why, in the face of her revelations, she still called herself Mrs. Triona. To spring her plain Mrs. Brigsdom on Medlow she had not the courage. She took counsel with Blaise Olifant. In his soldier-scholar protecting way he seemed a rock of refuge. He said, "Write to them through Rowington and ask them to hold their hands until you can put them into communication with your husband, which you give your word of honour to do as soon as you learn his address." She did so. The bargain was accepted. When she received Rowington's letter, she danced into Olifant's study, and sitting on the corner of his table, flourished it in his face. "Oh, the relief of it! I feel 10 years younger. I was on the verge of becoming an old woman. Now it will never come out." Olifant leaned back in his chair and looked at her wistfully. A faint flush coloured her cheeks, and her eyes were lit with the gladness of hundreds of days ago. Her lips were parted, showing the white, girlish teeth. Sitting there, vividly alive in the intimate attitude, smiling on him, she was infinitely desirable. "No," said he, "it will never come out." A cloud passed over her face. "Still, one never knows." "I have faith in Alexis," said he. "He's a man of his word." "I think you're the loyalest creature that ever lived." He raised a deprecating hand. "I would I were," said he. "What do you mean by that?" she asked pleasantly. "If I were," said he, his nose seeming to lengthen over the wry smile of his lips, "if I were, I would go out into the world and not rest till I brought him back to you." She slid to her feet. "With a barber's basin for a helmet and the rest of the equipment. If you did such an idiot thing I should hate you. Don't you understand that he's gone out of my life altogether?" "Life is a long, long time to look forward to for a woman so young as yourself." "You mean I might fall in love with somebody else, and there would be horrid complications?" She laughed in the cocksureness of youth. "Oh, no, my dear Blaise. Once bitten, twice shy. 3 times, 4 times, all the multiplication table times shy." Though impelled by primitive instinct, he could not press her further. He found himself in a position of poignant absurdity, compensated by the sweetness of their daily companionship. Sometimes he wondered how it could be that an awakened woman like Olivia could remain in calm ignorance of his love. Yet she gave never a sign of knowledge. She accepted friendship with full hands and gave it with full heart. Beyond that, nothing. From his sensitive point of view, it was all for the best. If, like a lean spider, he sat down beside her and talked of love, he would indubitably frighten Miss Muffet away from Medlow. Further, she would hold him in detestation for intentions which, in the queer circumstances, had no chance of being what the world calls honourable. He therefore put up with what he could get. The proclamation of her eternal man-shyness sounded like her final word on her future existence. So he came back to Roeington. "I'm glad that's all settled," said he. "Now you can take up the threads of life again." "What do you think I can make of them?" she asked. "I can't sit here idle all my life. Not here at the Towers," she laughed, "for I'm not going to inflict myself on you for a lifetime. But here, in the world." He had no practical suggestion to make, but he spoke from the sincerity of his tradition. "A woman like you fulfills her destiny by being her best self." "But being good is scarcely an occupation." He smiled. "I give it up, my dear. If you like, I can teach you geology." She laughed. Geology had to do with dead things. She cared not a hang for the past. She wanted to forget it. The epoch of the Dinosaurus and the period of the past year were, save for a few hundreds of centuries, contemporaneous. No past, thank you. The present and the future for her. The present was mere lotus-eating, delightful but demoralizing. It was the future that mattered. "If only you were an astrologer and could bind me apprentice," she said. "No," she added after a pause, "there's nothing for it. I must do something. I think I'll go in for infant welfare and breed bulldogs." She watched him as he laboriously stuffed his pipe with his one hand by means of a little winch fixed to the refectory table and lit by a match struck on a heavy mat-stand, refraining from helping him, although all the woman in her longed to do so, for she knew his foibles. The very first time he had entered the house he had refused her offer of help with his Burberry. He needed a woman to look after him, not a sister, not a landlady lodger friend, a wife, in fact, whose arm and hand he would accept unquestionably in lieu of his own. A great pity sprung in her heart. Why had no woman claimed him, a man stainless in honour, exquisite in thought, loyal of heart, and, not the least qualification for the perfect gentle knight in a woman's eyes, soldier-like in bearing? There was something missing. That was all the answer she could give herself. Something intangible, something magnetic, possessed by the liar and scamp who had been her husband. She could live with Blaise Olifant for 100 years in perfect amity, in perfect sympathy, but with never a thrill. She knew well enough the basis of sentiment underlying his friendship. If she were free to marry, he would declare himself in his restrained and dignified way. But with the barrier of the living Alexis between them, she laughed at the possibility of such a declaration. And yet her inward laughter was tinged with bitterness. What kind of a man was it who, loving a woman, did not catch her round the waist and swing her on his horse and ride away with her? Of course, she herself would have something to say in the matter. She would fight tooth and nail. She would fling the ravisher to kingdom come. But still her sex would have the gratification of being madly desired. In some such confused way, she thought, the horror of Mavena and the romantic mastery of Alexis arising in comparison and contrast, to say nothing of Bobby Quinton. "I wonder how you can put up with me," she said, when he set his pipe comfortably going. "Put up with you? What do you mean?" "You and I are so different." He had some glimmer of the things working behind her dark eyes. "Do you still want adventures? Medlow is too dull for you?" She felt guilty and cried impulsively, "Oh, no, no, no. This is peace. This is heaven. This is all I want." and for a time she persuaded herself that it was so. Then there came a day when the lilac and the laburnum were out in the garden behind the house, and the row of beeches screening it from the east wind were all a riot of tender green, and Olivia was sitting with a book in the noon sunshine, and the book lay unread on her lap, for her thoughts went back to a magical day of greenery in Richmond Park, an imperishable memory. Her eyes filled with tears. For a few moments she had recaptured the lost Alexis in that remembered hour of blue mist and mystery, and now he was in Poland. Doing what? The French window of Olifant's study opened, and he came down the gravelled path towards her, a letter in his hand. His face was serious. She rose to meet him. "I don't know whether I ought to show you this, but perhaps later you might blame me if I didn't." She uttered a little cry which stuck in her throat. "Alexis?" "Yes." The eagerness with which she grasped the letter brought a touch of pain into his eyes. Surely she loved the man still. "I'm afraid it gives less than news of him," said he. But already reading the letter, she gave no heed to his words. The letter was from Warsaw, and it ran: "Sir, I was commissioned by my friend Mr. John Briggs to communicate with you should anything befall him. Now something must have befallen him, because he has failed to keep with me very definite engagements into which he had entered with the utmost good faith and enthusiasm. He was to start on his journey thither to join the Polish service on a certain day. He was furnished with railway tickets and passports, also on the night before his departure with a letter to friends in Prague where he was to await my coming, and with a letter to friends in Warsaw in case political exigencies should delay my arrival in Prague. The Prague letter has not been delivered, nor has Mr. Briggs appeared in Warsaw, nor have I received from him any explanatory communication. That he should have changed his mind at the last moment is incredible, as his more than zealous intentions cannot be questioned. This letter therefore has a double object: first, to acquaint you with these facts, and secondly, to beg of you of your courtesy to give me any information you may possess as to the fate of one whom I learned to hold in affectionate esteem. Yours faithfully, Paul Boronowski." Olivia grew very pale. Her hand shook as she gave the letter back to Olifant. "Something must have happened to him," he said. "What has always happened to him?" she replied bitterly. "He says one thing and does another, one more senseless, extravagant lie." "He was obviously going to Poland," said Olifant. "But he never started." Olifant persisted. "How do you know?" "What can one ever know about him except that truth has no meaning for him? If you suggest that he's perished by the way on a railway journey between here and Prague—" She laughed scornfully. "Really, my dear Blaise, you're too good for this world. If you caught a man with his hand in your waistcoat pocket, and he told you he only wanted to see the time by your watch, you believe him. Haven't I been through this before? All this elaborate preparation for missions abroad which never came off. Didn't he leave you here to go off to Helsingfors, and John O'Groats was the nearest to it he got?" "Then where do you think he is now?" "Anywhere except in Poland. It's the last place he had any intention of going to." "He might have written you a false account of his movements," Olifant argued. "But why should he have deceived this good Polish gentleman?" "It's his way," she replied wearily. "Oh, don't you see? He's always acting to himself. He can't help leading a fictitious life. I can guess the whole thing. He goes to this Mr. Boronowski, one of his stray Russo-Polish acquaintances, with the idea in his head of putting me off his scent. Poland still is romantic, and a terribly long way off. He can't do a thing simply, he must do it fantastically. It's not enough that I should think he was going to Poland. Mr. Boronowski must think so too. He throws his arms about, persuading himself and everybody else that he's a paladin going to fight for the sacred cause of an oppressed nationality. When the thing's done and the letter to me written, the curtain comes down on the comedy, and Alexis takes off his war paint and starts off for Pernambuco or Haverstock Hill." "I think you're unjust, Olivia," said Olifant. "And I think you're too good to be true," she retorted angrily, and she left him and went down the garden path into the house. In her room, her mother's room, with the old rose curtains and Chippendale and watercolours, she rang the bell. Mara appeared. "You know so much already, Mara," she said in her defiant way, "so I think you ought to know everything. I've just heard that Mr. Triona never went to Poland." "Indeed," said Mara impassively. "Do you know where he is?" "No, and I don't want to." "I can't quite understand," said Mara. "I wish you would take some interest in the matter." "My interest is your interest. If you never want to see him again, what does it matter where he is? Perhaps you're afraid he'll come back to you." At the older woman's suggestion, the fear gripped her with dreadful suddenness. There had not yet been time for thought of such a possibility. If he had lied about fighting for Polish freedom, what truth was there in his perfervid declaration of the severance of his life from hers? She had been right in her analysis of his character. The curtain down on whatever comedy he might be now enacting, he would present himself unexpectedly before her, with specious explanations of the past, and another glittering scenario of illusion. And with his reappearance would come exposure. She had pledged her word to Rowington. She seized Mara by the wrist. "Do you think he will?" "You're afraid," said Mara. "Yes, dreadfully afraid." "I don't think you need be," said Mara. Olivia flung away. "You take his part just like Major Olifant. Neither of you seem to understand." She turned. "Don't you see the horror of it?" "I've seen lots of horrors in my time," replied Mara placidly, "but I shan't see this one. He's gone for good, dearie. You may be sure of that." "I wish I could think so," said Olivia. It was nearly lunch-time. Mara went out and returned with a can of hot water. "You'll not see him so long as I'm about to look after you," she remarked. And Olivia laughed at the dragon of her childhood. Some mornings afterwards, Mara came to her mistress. "If it's convenient to you, I should like a few days' leave. I've had a letter." "Nothing serious, I hope?" asked Olivia, whose thoughts flew to the madman in the county asylum. "I don't know," said Mara. "Can I go?" "Of course," said Olivia. So Mara packed her worn valise and left Medlow by the first available train. But the asylum was not her destination. The next day saw her seeking admittance to University College Hospital, London. End of chapter 21. Chapter 22 of The Tale of Triona by William John Locke. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 22. When Triona, after many dim daydreams and relapses into nothingness, at last recovered consciousness, he found himself in a narrow sort of cubicle, staring upwards at a mile-away ceiling. He was tightly bound, body and legs. He had a vague memory of a super-juggernaut of a thing killing him. Therefore he sagely concluded that he was dead, and this was the next world. It occurred to him that the next world had been singularly overrated, being devoid of any interest for an intelligent being. Later, when the familiar figure of a nurse popped round the screen, he recognized with some relief the old universe. He was alive, but where he was he had no notion. Only gradually did he learn what had befallen him, that he had lain for weeks unconsciousness, that he had a broken thigh and crushed ribs, that most of the time he had hovered between life and death, that even now he was a very sick man who must lie quiet and do exactly what nurses and doctors told him. This sufficed for a time, while his brain still worked dully. But soon there came a morning when all the memories surged back. He questioned the nurse. "When do you think I can start for Poland?" "Perhaps in 6 months," she replied soothingly. He groaned. "I want to go there now." "What for?" "To join the Polish army." She had nursed through the war, and knew that men in his plight were of no further use in armies. Gently she told him so. He stared incomprehensively on an empty world. "What can I do when I leave here?" "You must have a long, long rest, and do nothing at all, and think of nothing at all." He tried to smile at the nurse's pleasant face. "You've done me a bad turn in bringing me back to life," said he. When they thought him capable of grappling with his personal affairs, they brought him his bulging pocket-book and bade him count his money. He laughed. It was quite safe. He handed back the roll of notes into the nurse's keeping. But the other contents of the case he looked at dismally. the passport with the foreign visas, the railway tickets, the letters to Prague and Warsaw. What were the good of them now? He would never go to Poland. When he got strong, all the fighting would be over. And when he did get strong, in a few months or a year, he would probably be lame, with odds and ends of organs gone wrong inside him. He tried to read the letters, but they were written in Polish, unintelligible now in spite of his strenuous short study of the language. They bore a signature which he could not decipher, but it was certainly not Boronowski. His mind soon tired of the puzzle. What was the good of keeping the letters? Drearily he tore them in pieces and gave them to the nurse to dispose of when she brought him a meal. Tired with the effort, he slept. He awoke to a sense of something final done, or something important left undone. As his brain cleared, he realized that subconsciously he had been thinking of his duty to Boronowski. Of course, he must be informed at once of the reason for his defection. And then dismay overwhelmed him. He had no address to Boronowski. The only channels of communication with him, the Prague and Warsaw letters, he had destroyed. A happy idea struck him. He toyed with it for what seemed interminable hours, until the nurse came to his bedside. He called for writing materials, which were smilingly denied him. He was too weak. But the nurse would write a short letter from dictation. He dictated 2 identical letters, one to the Polish legation, one to the Polish consulate, asking for the address of Mr. Paul Boronowski, late of 21 Hilditch Street, St. Pancras. By return of post came polite replies from legation and consulate. Both disclaimed any knowledge of the identity of Mr. Paul Boronowski. Legation and consulate were blandly ignorant of the existence of their confidential agents. Then he remembered the baffling signature to the 2 letters. He laughed somewhat bitterly. His life seemed to be involved in a tangle of false names. After all, what did it matter? But it did matter, vitally. If ever he had set his soul on a true thing, he had set it on keeping faith with Boronowski, and Boronowski, like the rest of the world, would set him down as an impostor. In his desperate physical weakness the tears rolled down his cheeks, and so the nurse found him, with one of the letters clutched in his thin hand. "My only friend in the world," said he. "Dead?" asked the nurse. "No, lost." He gave her the letter. "Surely you have at least one more," she said. "In fact, I've written to her to tell her of your recovery." "Her?" He looked at the nurse out of ghastly eyes. "Miss Mara Stebbings." "Oh, my God!" said he, and fainted. Whereat the nurse, anxious to bring him comforting tidings, was exceedingly troubled. The shock put him back for 2 or 3 days. He grew light-headed, and raved about a woman called Olivia, and about all sorts of strange and incomprehensible things. When he regained his senses, it was an awakening to a life of even more terrifying consternation than before. Mara, he learned, had called daily at the hospital, to be denied access to him till he should be in a fit state to receive her. The nurse told him of her first visit, the morning after the accident, and of the newspaper paragraph which she had chanced to read. But if Mara knew, surely Olivia knew, and Olivia, knowing him to have been for weeks at death's door, had treated him as though he had already passed through that door to the other side. Horror gripped him. He questioned the nurse. This Miss Stebbings, had she left no message? No, she was a woman of few words. She had said in an unemotional way, "I'll come in again tomorrow." "For God's sake, don't let her see me," he cried. But after a while he countermanded the request. He would learn the worst, and meet steadily the supreme punishment, the tale of Olivia's implacable hatred. There were degrees in a woman's scorn. Much, he knew, had been justly incurred, but his sick frame shuddered at this maximum of contempt and loathing. Ill-conditioned dog, he avowed himself, yet to let him die, for aught she knew, like a dog, without sign or word of interest, it transcended thought. "Are you sure there has been no other lady? Not a letter of inquiry? Nothing?" "You'll make yourself bad again if you worry like that," said the nurse. "I wish to God I could," said he, "and that would be the end of it all." In a large ward of a London hospital, nurses have not much time to devote to the sick fancies of patients. More than enough for them were their physical needs. The crumb of kindly commonplace was all that the nurse could give to the man's hungering soul. He passed the day staring up at the mile-high ceiling, incurious as to what vista of misery lay beyond the still remaining American cloth-covered screen. From the shaft of fierce sunshine on the wall to his right, he gathered that spring had passed into early summer. The outside world was a riot in the new life of wild flowers and trees and birds and human hopes and loves. Outside that prison of his, a whitewashed wall, a screen, a window behind his head reaching sky-high, spread this world with whose pulsations his heart had ever throbbed in unison. God, how he had loved it! Every leaf, every crested wave, every patch of sand, every stretch of heat, every rusty horse grazing on a common, every child before a cottage door, every vibrating sound or sight of great cities, every waste in regions of grand desolation, every man with sinews or with purpose in his eyes, every woman parading the mystery of her sex, from the tow-haired, dirt-encrusted goose-girl of a Russian village to the wonder of every inscrutable wonders that was Olivia. In all his dreams he inevitably came back to Olivia. Indeed, she was the centripetal force of his longings. All that earth held of the rustle of leaves and the murmur of waters, the magic of dawn and the roar of town multitudes and the laughter of green forests and the silence of frozen steppes, were incorporated in the woman of his adoration. Through her spoke the voices of the infinite universe, and all that was visible of it, the patch of sunlight on the whitewashed wall, said, "She lives, and I, a reflected glory of her, live too. But even if you go hence, I shall only appear mockingly before you on prison walls until you are dead. And you will never find me on the blue seas, or the joyous roads, or the stone-bounded, clattering haunts of mankind, other than a meaningless mirage, because the inspired meaning of it all, which is Olivia, has passed from you for evermore." "Damn you!" said he, and turned away his head, for he could not turn his plaster of Paris-encased body, and shut out the white line from his burning eyes. The next morning Myra came. He had been prepared for her visit. She sat on the cane-bottomed chair by his bedside. As soon as the nurse left them together, "I'm glad you are better, sir," she said. "Have you brought me any message from Mrs. Triona?" he asked. She looked at him steadily. "You don't suppose Mrs. Triona knows you are here?" It was some time before he could appreciate the meaning of her words. "She thinks I'm in Poland?" "She doesn't know you are here," said Myra truthfully. "She doesn't know where you are." "Or care?" "Or care," said Myra, and her tone was flat like that of a fate. For a while he was silent, accepting the finality of Myra's words. "You've left her in ignorance of my accident?" "Yes," said Myra. "Haven't you done the same since you've recovered your wits?" Her dry logic was unanswerable. Yet a man does not expect logic from an elderly waiting woman. He passed a hand over his eyes and held it there for a long time, while Myra sat patient and unemotional. He understood nothing of her motives. For the moment he did not seek to understand them. One fact alone mattered. Olivia did not know. She had not, with horrible contempt, left him to die like a dog. By the thought of such a possibility he had wronged her. She might, with every reason, desire never to set eyes on him again, but of active cruelty he should have known her incapable. Presently he withdrew his hand and turned to Myra. "My head's not altogether right yet," he said, half apologetically. "I can quite believe it," said Myra. "Why you should bother with me, I don't understand," he said. "Neither do I," she replied in her disconcerting way. "If you had died I shouldn't have been sorry. For her sake. Now you're not going to die, I'm glad. For yours." "Thank you," said he with a note of irony. And then, after a pause, "How is your mistress?" "She's quite well, sir." "And happy?" "Begging your pardon, sir," said Myra stiffly, "but I've not come here to be asked questions. I've no intention of your using me as a go-between." "It never entered my head," he declared. "It might," said Myra. "So I give you a warning. Whatever go-betweening I do will be to keep you apart from Mrs. Triona." "Then why are you worrying about me?" he asked. "Because I found you in affliction, and I'm a Christian woman." Neither of them understood the other. He said suddenly, with a flash of the old fire, "Will you swear you'll never tell your mistress where I am?" A faint light flickered in her pale eyes. "I'll swear if you like. But haven't you taken in what I've been telling you all the time?" "So long as we can trust each other, that is all that matters." "You can trust me all right," said Myra. They talked the ground over again for a while longer. Then he grew tired with the strain, and the nurse put an end to the interview. But Myra came the next day, and the day after that, and Triona grew to long for her visit. He became aware of a crabbed kindness in her attitude towards him, side by side with her jealous love for Olivia. She was anxious for his welfare within grimly prescribed limitations. His immediate future concerned her. What did he purpose to do with his invaliddom after his discharge from the hospital? He himself at this stage had no notion. He confided to her the despair of his active life. The motor lorry had wrecked his hopes of salvation. He told her the whole Boronovsky story. Myra nodded, but, faithful to the part she had chosen, she said nothing of Boronovsky's letter to Major Olifant. Only by keeping the lives of the ill-fated pair in tightly sealed and non-communicable compartments could she be true to an ethical code formulated by many definite sorrows and many vague, but none the less poignant, spiritual conflicts. "It's funny," said he, "that you're the only human being I should know in the world." Her intuition skipped the gap of demonstration of so extraordinary a pronouncement, and followed his flight into the unknown. "It might be luck for you," she said. He smiled wistfully on her. "Why?" He hung on her answer, which she took some time to give. In the lines of the pallid face, in the dull blue eyes of this sphinx-like woman, so correct in her negative attire of black coat and skirt and black hat with just a redeeming touch of white, and on the thin compressed lips, his sick man's brain seemed to read his destiny. She hovered over him, impressive, baffling, ever about to be oracular. Combined with her mystery existed the strange fact that she was his sole link with the world, not only the great humming universe of thought and action, but the inner spiritual world in which Olivia reigned. He regarded her with superstitious dread and reverence, conscious all the time of the comedy of so regarding the woman whose duty had been to fold up his trousers and set out his underclothes on the hot rail of the bathroom. "What are you going to do when you leave?" she asked, and he guessed a purpose behind her question. "I must hide until I am strong enough to take up active life again." "Where will you hide?" He didn't know. He had not thought, so remote did the date of his discharge appear. It must be some secluded, man-forgotten spot. "If the worst comes to the worst and you need a place where you'll be looked after, I'll give you an address of friends of mine," said Myra. "You'll maybe spend the rest of your life on crutches and have all sorts of things wrong inside you. I shouldn't like you to feel I was abandoning you. If you were broken down and needed help, I suppose you wouldn't write to me, would you?" "I most certainly shouldn't," said Triona. "I thought so," said Myra. "In that case I'd better give you the address." She scribbled it on the writing-pad by his bedside. "There, take it or leave it. It's the best I can do." She left him with an abrupt "Good day, sir," and took the next train back to Medlow. "You haven't had a long holiday, Myra," Olivia remarked when she arrived. "I didn't say I was going on a holiday." "I hope things were all right." "As right as they ever can be," replied Myra. The weary weeks of convalescence dragged themselves out. Myra did not come again, and of course he had no other visitor. He made casual acquaintances in the ward, here and there an ex-soldier with whom he could exchange reminiscences of warfare. Once a discharged sailor in the next bed, the screen had long since been removed, recovering from an operation, spoke to him of mine-sweeping days and perils of storm and submarine, and he grew to regard him as a brother. Both regretted the deluging waters of the North Sea. The sailor, in these times of peace, drove a dust cart for the St. Pancras Borough Council. The wages were good, but what a life for a seafaring man! He would have stuck to his old job were it not that a wave had washed him down on the slithery deck and had brought his kneecap up against the stanchion and had stiffened it out so that his career on board ship was over. But those were good times, weren't they? Oh, yes. Of course they groused, but they only groused when they had time. Mostly they hadn't. Dust collecting was an open-air life, true enough, but there was a difference between the smell of brine and the stench of house refuse. It was in summer that it made him sick. The odours of the forecastle were not those of a hairdresser's shop. Nothing smelt so fine, he declared, as a hairdresser's shop. They were a bit thick, but a man could go on deck and fill his lungs with good salt air. And the grub! What an appetite! He conjured up gargantuan meals in perilous tempests. Nothing of the sort now. Everything he ate tasted of sour potato peelings. That's the taste of everything in these post-war days, said Triona. Everything in life, sour potato peelings. The dustman reckoned he was right. In those old days of mine-sweeping a man had no anxieties. He had no responsibilities. He was happy as the day was long. Now he was married and already had a couple of kids. Life was just one wearisome worry, a continuous accumulation on the debit side of the slate, with few advantages on the credit side to balance. If it wasn't the wife, it was the boy. If it wasn't the boy, it was the baby. And if it wasn't them, it was his appendix which had just been removed. Whoever heard of a sailor man aboard ship getting appendicitis? No, all of them things, said he, were blessings of peace. Besides, how was he going to feed his family when they grew older? And clothes, boots, schooling? And he himself, limited to beer. Such beer! He hadn't tasted a drop of rum. Was there anything like it? Sometimes he saw it and smelt it in his dreams, but he always woke up before he could put his lips to the pannikin. If only one could get something to hold on to in dreams. He never had need to dream of rum in the Navy. So much for peace. Give him the good old war again. And when his wife, a thin-lipped, scraggy blonde with a moth-eaten fur stole round her neck, although it was sweltering summer, and a padded baby in her arms, came to visit him, and spoke querulously of domestic affairs, Triona gave him his unreserved sympathy. And it ain't, said the ex-mariner, as if I couldn't carry on straight and proper in civil life. Wonder how many of my mates are getting what I'm getting. She ought to be proud of me, she ought. Instead of that, you heard what she said? Triona had heard. She had upbraided him for his ungenteel occupation, considering herself the daughter, as Triona learned, of a small sweetstuff monger in Dover, where they had met during his sea-going days, socially degraded by her marriage with a municipal collector of dust. She had married him, by the by, before his present appointment, while he was drawing out of work pay. Apparently he was possessed of some low-comedy histrionic talent, and she was convinced that he could make his fortune as a cinema star. "You married?" he asked. "Not now," said Triona. "You've been through it," said the misogynist. "Women. There never was a woman who knew when she was well off. Oh, Gord! Give me the old days on the Barracuda, where there wasn't any thought of women. That was my last ship. I had 9 months in her. There was Barracuda, Annie Sands, Seahorse." He ran through the names of his squadron, forgetful in the sudden flush of reminiscence of domestic cares. "And what did you say you was in?" "Vestris." "Of course, I remember. Torpedoed. But even that was better than this." Triona agreed, and the eternal talk of the sea went on, until the nostalgia for the wide free spaces of the world gripped his vitals with the pains of hunger. "What are you going to do when you come out?" asked the dustman. "About the same as you," replied Triona. "What's the good of a man with a game leg?" The dustman sighed. "You've got education," said he. At first, aware of accent and manner of expression, the dustman had taken him for an ex-officer. Only the discharge papers of John Briggs, able seaman, convinced him of John Briggs' lowly estate. Still, in the Barracuda they had an elderly stoker who had been at Cambridge College. Such a man might be his neighbour. "I ran away to sea when I was a boy," said Triona. So had the dustman. He waxed more confidential. His name was Josh Bunnings, and he had sailed in every conceivable kind of craft from Alaska to Singapore. but he found no time for education. How did his neighbour acquire it? Books? He shook his head. He'd been cured of books on his first voyage, when the second mate, catching him reading a tattered manual on gardening, when he ought to have been washing up in the galley, had kicked and cuffed him round the deck. Triona's mind went back to his boyhood, to an almost identical incident. There was much in common between himself and Jos Bunnings. They had started on even terms. They had met on even terms in the foul forecastles on the North Sea. They were on even terms now, lying side by side, lamed, their life of free adventure a thing of the past. Each dreaded the future. Jos Bunnings condemned to cart refuse between the affected nose of a shrew of a wife for the remainder of his days. He, Triona, to deal with such refuse as the world would leave him, but away from the wife who abhorred him and all his works. On the other hand, between him and Jos Bunnings lay a great gulf. He had made himself a man of wide culture. Jos Bunnings had remained abysmally ignorant. But Jos Bunnings had lived his life an honourable man. If he told his story to Jos Bunnings, he would be condemned by it, even as he had been condemned by his sister on the morning of his mother's funeral. So when the dustman, with another sigh, harked back to his former idea and said, "If only I had an education," "You're a damn sight better man than I am without it," Triona replied bitterly. When the 3 weeks' comradeship came to an end on the discharge of Jos Bunnings, he found himself lost again in a friendless world. The neighbouring familiar bed was occupied by an ancient man in the throes of some ghastly malady, and around him was stretched the horrible, death-suggesting screen. And behind the screen, a week later, the old man died. It was to relieve the nervous tension of this week that he began a correspondence with Jos Bunnings. The writing man's instinct awoke, the mania of self-expression. His letters to the dustman, full of the atmosphere of the ward, vivid with lightning sketches of house surgeons, sisters, nurses, and patients, with here and there excursions into contrasting tempests, storms of battle, and everything touched with the magic of his queer genius, would, if sent to his literary agents, have gained him a year's subsistence. Jos Bunnings visited him occasionally, when free from municipal, and escaped from domestic obligations. The visits, he explained, were in return for the letters. For being no scholar, he could not reply. Then one day he appeared and sat on the chair by Triona's bed, with the air of a man about to bring glad tidings. He was rather a heavy, pallid, clean-shaven man, with a curl of black hair sweeping down to his eyebrows. His small, dark eyes gleamed. At once he disemburdened his honest soul. He was a Church of England man, always held with church-going. So did his wife. It was the great bond of union between them. So he was on friendly terms with the curate of St. Simon's. And being on friendly terms with the curate, he had shown him the letters. "And would you believe it, mate?" said he. "Would you believe it? He wants to put them in print in the parish magazine. In print! Fancy!" He slapped his thigh. Triona stared at him for a moment, and then laughed out loud for the first time for many weeks. "What are you laughing at?" asked the astonished Bunnings. "It seems so funny," said Triona. "That's what I thought." "And a great honour," said Triona, recovering. "Of course, and he said he couldn't print 'em without your permission." Triona gave permission, stipulating, however, that his name should not be used. His modesty forbade it, he explained. Jos Bunnings went away delighted. In the course of a few posts came a grateful letter from the curate. In Mr. Briggs's writing he saw signs of considerable literary talent, which he hoped Mr. Briggs would cultivate. If he could be of help in this way, he put his services at Mr. Briggs's disposal. Triona again laughed, with grim amusement, at a funny, ironical world. Then, suddenly, the underlying tragedy of this comic interlude smote him breathless. Alexis Triona was dead, and so were his writings, for evermore. But the impulse to write stirred within him so vehemently that even in these idle letters to Jos Bunnings he put all his vividness of literary expression. The curate's dim recognition of the unusual was a sign and a token. Whatever he wrote would be stamped with his individuality, and if published, even anonymously, would lead to his identification. The arresting quality of his style had been a main factor in his success. This flashing pictorial way of his he could not change. If he strove self-consciously to write sober prose, he would produce dull, uninspired stuff that no man could read. If he lost self-consciousness, automatically he would betray himself. He would reappear in the Olivia-dominated world. Every book or article would dance before his eyes like an ignis fatuus, reminding her maddeningly of his existence in her propinquity. An ignis fatuus. At this point of his reflection, he remembered his first talk with her, wherein he had counselled her never to lose faith in her will-o'-the-wisp, but to compel it to be her guiding star. More ironical laughter from the high gods. And yet, why not? He wrestled with the temptation. As he lay, convalescent on his back, his brain clear, the sap of youth working in his veins, the uncontrolled fancies of the imaginative writer wove themselves into shreds of fine romance and tapestries of exquisite scenes. Just a little concentration, impossible in the open hospital ward, and all these would blend together into a thing of immortal beauty. He would find a publisher, nothing easier. No name would appear. Or else perhaps as a handle for convenience sake he would sign the book incognito. It would stir the hearts of men, and they would say, "There is but one man living who could do this, and that is Alexis Triona." And Olivia, reading it and beholding him in it, would find her heart stirred with the rest, yet far, far more deeply than the rest, and would seek him out, obeying his far-off counsel, and believe that in his essential self and in his infinite love he was verily her guiding star. But when the hour of exaltation had passed and given way to the dreary commonplace, when the nurse came to wash him like a child, or to chatter pleasantly of the outside world, the review she had seen on her free afternoon, or the sentimental novel which had beguiled her scanty leisure, he knew that he had been living in a land of dreams. His real achievement Olivia knew, and by it she was unmoved. Mara had held out to him no chance of hope, only certainty of despair. By no further achievement could Olivia be persuaded. She realized her will-o'-the-wisp as what it really was, a miasmatic gas leading her into quagmires. She would bitterly resent his reappearance. It would be another trick, another way of flaunting before her under false pretences. As well write to her now that he was a mangled wreck in University College Hospital. In the course of time he was able to leave his bed and be wheeled about the ward, and afterwards to hobble about on a crutch. But the injured leg was just a bit shorter than the other, so that he was condemned to a perpetual limp. And though the ribs were mended, yet their breakage had occasioned internal lesions which would have to be watched for the rest of his life. No more adventures in wide spaces, no more tramps to John O'Groats. "But I'm a born wanderer," he cried to the surgeon who made the final pronouncement. "What shall I do when the wander fever is on me?" "Fill yourself up with bromide and stick leeches on your head." He laughed into the smiling, kindly face, and was silent for a moment. "I can drive a car, I suppose," he said after a while. "Safer to drive a horse. You haven't to crank it up." "So I'm going out a hopeless crock." "Oh no, there's no reason why you shouldn't live with reasonable care to 90. You're fit for light work. Why not office work? An educated chap like you. By the way, you were off to Poland, if I remember rightly, when you met with your accident. What's your trade or profession?" "Before the war I was a cosmopolitan chauffeur," said Triona. "And since?" "The damnedest fool God ever made." The surgeon asked him no more questions. End of chapter 22. Chapter 23 of The Tale of Triona by William John Locke. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 23. Fanstead is a little country town built on the plan of a sparsely equipped herringbone. There is the central high street, a jumble of old half-timbered houses and staring modern red-brick buildings, and sprouted from it a series of lateral roads, lanes, and alleys, dwindling in importance to the High Street tip, and each petering out into the sweet country vagueness of hedges and fields. All save two. One of these ends abruptly at an inconveniently distant railway station. The other, villa-bordered, meanders pleasantly for a mile or so to the tiny village of Pendish, where it meets at right angles the great high road and stops modestly, confronted all of a sudden with rolling open country, swelling downs patched with meadow and cornfield, and crowned with great clumps of woodland. Pendish was too small even to have a church. There was a tiny chapel for the convenience of Baptists, but Anglicans tramped into Fenstead, or to the larger village of Banton-on-the-Hill, another mile along the great high road. It had a tumble-down inn, the Whip and Collar, and a straggling row of thatched cottages, and a tiny red brick villa labelled as the home of the county police. But it also had a post office, which was also a shop, and this was a small, square, two-storied Georgian house, imposing among its thatched neighbours, and maintaining itself with a curious air of dignity, in spite of the front door open to the public during business hours, and the miscellaneous assortment of sweets, tobacco, tapes, and picture postcards exposed in what was once the dining-room window. It was the freehold of Mrs. Petterland, a widow of 50. She had inherited it from her father, a Norfolk thatcher who had brought his mystery to the West, and practising it with skill, and saving a little fortune brought to him by his wife, had amassed enough to buy the square stone house where he had ended his days. They said in the village that he had never recovered from the shock occasioned by the fate of his son, his apprentice, and later his partner, who had gone raving mad a week or two after his marriage, and had to be confined in the county asylum. Well, the old man had slept with his fathers for many years. His wife had joined him. The son still lingered on in the madhouse, and Mrs. Petterland, very much alone in the world, save for her husband's relatives in Fenstead, sold stamps and sweets to the village, and, as a very great favour, let the best bedroom to an occasional painter with unimpeachable introductions. She was dark-haired, fresh-coloured, and buxom. She dressed with neatness, wearing old-fashioned stays that gave her a waist and a high bust, and she was the most considerable personage in Pendish. When she had received a letter from her sister-in-law, Mara Stebbings, asking her as a favour to put up a foolish young man named Briggs, who got himself run over by a motor-lorry, if ever he should act on her suggestion and come to Pendish, she considered it less as an introduction than as a command. Whether she loved Mara or not, she did not know, but she had an immense respect for the dry, grey-faced woman who had come every year to stay with her, so that she could visit the brother whom she had loved in the house of orphanness 5 or 6 miles away. She stood somewhat in awe of Mara. Her own good man had died comfortably in his bed, and had gone for ever after a couple of years of placid content. It was sad, but it was the common lot. The Lord giveth and the Lord taketh away. But at the idea of a woman's husband being shut off from the world in the living tomb of the county asylum, she shuddered. Mara always conveyed to her the vague impression, so impossible to be formulated by an uneducated woman ignorant of traditional reference, of a human soul defying the tragedy of existence. So, when this Mr. Briggs wrote from the hospital in London, she sent him a cordial answer. Any friend of Mara Stebbings was more than welcome. She would not charge him more than out-of-pocket expenses, for she did not know who this foolish young man might be. Mara, sphinx-like as usual, had given no clue. But for Mara to ask a favour was an unprecedented occurrence. She must have far more than ordinary interest in the welfare of the young fellow. Mrs. Petterland's curiosity was aroused, and she waited the arrival of her new lodger with impatience. The station car from the Fenstead garage brought him, on a late summer afternoon, with his brown canvas kit-bag and suit-case and khaki overcoat. She stood in the pedimented doorway, over which was fixed the wooden post-office board, and watched him descend. He faced her for a moment and raised his hat. "Mrs. Petterland?" She looked at his clear-cut face, so boyish in spite of whiteness and haggardness, at his careless brown hair sweeping over his temples, at the lips parted in a smile, at the lithe young figure. She caught the significance of his uplifted hat and the pleasant tone of his voice. In her limited category of values he would be only one thing, a gentleman. The manners of an instant charmed her. "Mr. Briggs?" I hope I shan't be a dreadful nuisance to you, but I need rest and quiet, and Miss Stebbings told me to come. And," he smiled, "what she says generally goes." "I see that you know her, sir," said Mrs. Petherton pleasantly. The luggage taken in, the cab dismissed, she led him up to his room, a large bed-sitting room looking over a wild garden and a wide expanse of rolling downs, with a faint white ribbon of high road circling in and out and round about them. His meals, she informed him, he could take in the parlour downstairs, without extra charge. "But I insist on paying my way," he said. "Unless my staying here is profitable to you, I can't remain. For the present, at least, I can well afford it." So a modest arrangement was made, and Triona settled down in his new home. For some days he enjoyed the peace of Pendish. He had brought with him books, ordered from the hospital, books which would take him long to read, some of the interminable modern French novels, a complete Fielding and Smollett, Paradise Lost and The Fairy Queen, neither of which he had as yet had time to go through. He spent hours in the sunny garden, riotous with ingenuous roses and delphinium and Canterbury bells and burning red-hot pokers, as they call them in the West. Often he limped along the green lanes that wound between the fields, up and down the downs. Becoming aware that he knew nothing of bird life, he procured through the Franstead bookshop popular works on British birds, and sitting under a tree in a corner of a meadow, would strive to identify them by their song and plumage and queer individual habits. He talked to the villagers. He talked to Mrs. Petherton, who told him the tragic story of Mara and the man in the county asylum. Of Mara's doings all the year round he found she knew little. She was with her lady, whom she had served most of her life, and had gone back with her to Medlow. Of the lady herself Mara never spoke. Mrs. Petherton did not know whether the lady was married or not. That was Mara Stebbings' way. She gave no information, and no one dared ask her questions. "She never even told me in her letter who you were, sir," she added. "I am just under her protection," he smiled. "She took me up when I had no one to defend me." "She's a curious woman," sighed Mrs. Petherton. "With strange taste in protégés," he laughed. "To tell you the truth, Mrs. Petherton, I don't quite know myself what I am. But doubtless sooner or later I'll do something to astonish you." The yearning to do this fretted his secret heart. To move about the summer fields when the weather was fine, to lounge in an easy chair over books in seasons of rain, was all very well for the period of convalescence after the confinement in the hospital ward. But after a while, when his muscles regained strength and the new blood coursing through his veins brought colour to his cheeks, he began to feel the old imperious need of movement and of action. Sometimes he went back, as in his talks with the dustman, to the idyllic tempests in the North Sea, sometimes to the fierce freedom of the speed across the illimitable steppes of Russia, sometimes to his perilous escape to Petrograd, sometimes to his tramps along the safe roads of England, to his wanderings through the dangerous byways of the East End. Bitterly he cursed the motor lorry that had knocked him out of his Polish adventure. Except on Olivia, he had never so set his heart on a thing before. Well, he shrugged angry shoulders, it was no use thinking of that. Poland had gone, like Olivia, out of his life, and when he came to think of it, so had everything that had made up all that he had known or conceived of life. He closed Tom Jones, and stared out of the window on the rain-drenched hills. Tom Jones, with his physical lustiness, his strong animal bravura, was more than he could bear. Tom Jones, no matter in what circumstance he was placed, had all the world before him. His gay confidence offended the lost man, for he was lost. Not a lost soul, he told himself. That was taking an absurd Byronical view of the matter. To pose as a modern Manfred would be contemptible. He went down to bedrock of commonplace. He was a lost man, a fact which was quite serious enough for any human being to contemplate with dismay. Lost, tied by a lame leg in a deadly little backwater of the world, where he must remain till he died. He could write, pour out all the fever of his soul into words, but what was the good if no word of his could be transmitted from this backwater into the haunts of men? Work without hope, a verse of Coleridge came vaguely to him, was like draining nectar through a sieve. It could only end in heartbreak. He stared through the dripping window-pane at the free hills, dim and hopeless in the mist of deluge. Nothingness confronted him. He wondered whether Mara, with diabolical insight and deliberate malice, had not lured him hither, so that she could hold him in relentless grip. At any rate, she had cast him into this prison. He lay awake all that night. The next morning the sky had cleared, and the sun shone down on the gratefully steaming land of green. He breakfasted in the tiny parlour opposite the shop post office on the ground floor. The ornaments in it were those of long ago. Prints of the landing of the Guards after the Crimea, of Queen Victoria and the Prince Consort. Curiously carved and polished coconut shells, and a great egg on which a staring mermaid was nudely painted, stood on the mantelpiece. On the chiffonier were calabashes with gaudy figures of indigenous Indians, such as came from the West Indies 70 years ago, and a model of a full-rigged ship under a glass case, and a moulting stuffed toucan with its great beak and yellow and red plumage. The late Mr. Pettiland's father, he had learned, had followed the sea. So, besides the objects on the crowded mantelpiece and in front of palm-leaf fans, were sprigs of white coral and strings of strange beads, and a dumpy, shapeless, wooden Polynesian god. And at the end lay a great conch shell with its wide, pink, curving lips, mysterious and alluring. He could scarcely eat. The night had shaken him. He gulped down some food and coffee, lit a pipe, and wandered restlessly about the room, looking at these tokens of the lands far away which he had never seen. The coral fascinated him. In the hospital he had read Taipi and Umu of Herman Melville in Dent's cheap collection of classics. The sight of the coral quickened dormant longings. He took the great conch shell in his hand, wondering at its beauty of curve and colour. And as he did so his mind went back to early childhood, to an old aunt whom he occasionally was taken to visit in torturing Sunday clothes, sacrosanct from the defilement of jam under dreadful penalties, and who possessed such a shell. He remembered that the shell was the glory that compensated the frigid horror of that house. He would hold it to his ear and listen to the boom of far-off surfs, and then go home and mingle the message with the pointing finger of Salvation Yeo. And now, grown man, inured to adventure, he put the shell to his ear, and the message was the same, vibrating the call of oceans thundering on distant beaches through the fibres of his being. He went out into the garden and stood in the sun and looked almost unseeingly at the rolling downs. Suddenly he became aware of the ribbon of road that lost itself not far away, behind a bluff. It was the great high road that led eventually to a great western port, where great ships sailed to the South Seas. The power seemed to impel him, as it had impelled him as a boy to run away from home. By following that road he would reach the port. At the port he could ship before the mast. On board his limp would not matter. For the rest he was strong as a lion, in spite of all pronouncements by the doctors. It was the one adventure life left open to him, nay, more, the one chance of maintaining his reason. He stood with hands clenched, staring at the road, the sweat beading on his forehead. To pack up belongings and arrive with genteel suitcase and kit bag at the dockside and expect to be taken on as an ordinary hand would be the act of an imbecile. He passed his hand mildly through his hair in his instinctive gesture. Why not go as he was, a cap on his head, and his money, all he had in the world, in a belt, bought for Poland, round his waist? It was escape from prison, escape from Mara, the final disappearance from the orbit of Olivia. Perhaps it was the maddest thing he had done in his life, but what did it matter? If he crocked up, he crocked up. At least he could try. He went indoors, and in the parlour found an old railway timetable. There were only 2 trains a day from Fanstead to the main line junction, and the morning train had already gone. Why should he not tramp to the junction, as in the old days, getting a lift here and there on a cart, and know again the freedom of the vagabond road? He went up to his room, put on his belt of money and good thick boots, and made up a bundle of necessaries. On his dressing-table he left a letter addressed to Mrs. Pettiland, enclosing a month's rent. He looked round the room for the last time, as he had looked round so many in his life, and laughed. No books on this journey. As he had not left the Tyneside with books years ago, so would he start now, afresh, with the same equipment. He went downstairs with a light heart and called out to Mrs. Pettiland, busy in her post office. "I'm going off on a jaunt, so don't expect me till you see me." And the answer came, "Don't overdo yourself with your lame leg." He laughed at the idea. His leg could bear his whole weight today without a twinge. Retracing his steps down the passage, he entered the garden and left the place by the wicket gate, and struck up the winding lanes and across fields to the high road, his stick and bundle over his shoulder. By doing so, instead of taking the road at the end of the village, he could cut off a mile. It was a morning of freshness and inspiration. A cool breeze sent the clouds scurrying across the sky and rustled the leaves of the elms and rippled the surface of the half-grown corn. His spirits rose as he walked, somewhat of a jog-trot walk, it is true, but that would last for the rest of his life. So long as the pain had gone forever, all was well. He reached the high road and settled down to his tramp, gladdened by the sight of cart and car and cottage gardens flaming with roses and hollyhocks, or restful with screens of sweet peas. In the soft-mannered West Country fashion, folks gave him good day as he passed. The road undulated pleasantly, now and then sweeping round the full bosom of a hill, with a steeply sloping drop of 30 feet to the valley. Such spots were grimly signposted for motorists, for at one of them, so Mrs. Pettiland had told him, a motor lorry during the war had slipped over at night and all the occupants had been killed. He regarded it with a chauffeur's eye and smiled contemptuously at the inefficiency of the driver. He could race along it at 60 miles an hour. But still, if you did go over, there was an end of you. By noon he was hungry and ate cold meat and bread at a wayside inn, and smoked contentedly afterwards on the bench outside, and talked of crops and licensing laws with the landlord. When he started again he felt stiff from the unaccustomed exercise. Walking would relax his muscles. Yet he began to tire. A while later he came upon a furniture-removing van which had broken down. Two men drew their heads from below the bonnet and looked at each other ruefully, and their speech was profane. He asked what was wrong. They didn't know. He threw off his coat, glad to get to an engine again, and in a quarter of an hour had set it going merrily. For 2 or 3 miles he sat on the tailboard between the two canvas-aproned packers, enjoying the respite. When they turned off eventually from the main road, and he had to descend, he felt strangely disinclined to walk. The junction was still a long way off. It would have been better, after all, to wait for the evening train from Fansted. He was always starting on crazy ventures without counting the cost. But he limped on. The road went through a desolate land of abandoned quarry and ragged pine woods. The ascent was steep. Suddenly, as though someone had pierced his leg with hot iron, flamed the unmistakable pain. He stood aghast at the pronouncement of doom. At that moment, while he hung there in agony, a rough figure of a man in old khaki slacks rose from a near hollow in the quarry, and approaching him, asked what time it was. Triona took out his watch, a gold one, the gift of Olivia. It was 4 o'clock. The man thanked him gruffly and returned to his stony Bethel. Triona hobbled on a few more steps, but the torture was too great. He must rest. The pine wood's cool quiet invited him. He dragged himself thither wearily and sat down, his back against the trunk of a tree. He tried to think. Of course the simplest method of extrication was to hail any passing car and beg for a lift, either to the junction or back to Pendish. Walking was out of the question. But which of those ways should he take? The weight of physical tiredness overwhelmed him and dulled the deciding brain. He had set out at 9 in the morning, and it was now 4 o'clock in the afternoon. He had not realized how slow his progress had been. Yes, he was exhausted and sleepy. Nothing mattered. He rolled on his side, stuck his arm under his head, and fell into a deep sleep. 30 yards away, at varying intervals, motor vehicles flashed by. He was dreaming of a rabbit running across his throat when suddenly he awoke to find the rabbit a man's arm. He gripped it instinctively. It was nearly dark. "What the devil are you doing?" The man replied, Why, we thought you was dead." At the significance of the plural, his grasp relaxed, and he sat up, staring at two men who had come upon him in his solitude. They were dirty, unshaven, not nice to look upon. On one of them he noticed a pair of old khaki slacks. As soon as he moved, they knelt, one on each side of him. "And if I'd been dead, you'd have run through my pockets, wouldn't you?" Suddenly he clapped his hands in front of him. "You swine, you've got my watch and chain." He thrust them aside and scrambled anyhow to his feet, and struck instinctively with his left full in the face of the nearest man, who had sprung up also. But all his weight was then on his left foot, and the flame of agony shot up through his thigh, and his leg crumpled up before the blow reached the man. Then the one in the khaki slacks came in with an uppercut on the point of his jaw, and he fell, senseless. When he recovered consciousness a few minutes afterwards, he found himself alone, dazed, rather sick, in an uncomprehended world of gathering darkness. Black clouds had swept over the brow of the quarry hill. A pattering noise some way off struck his ear. He realized it was rain on the road. He drew himself up to a sitting posture, and in a moment or two recovered wits and memory. There had been a fight. There was one man in khaki slacks. Why, that was the man who had asked him the time at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. He had lain in wait for him and robbed him of his watch and chain. What a fool he had been to parade it in this manner! Well, it was gone. It would teach him a lesson in prudence. But the other man, how did he come in? Why did they wait 3 or 4 hours before attacking him? Perhaps the man of the khaki slacks had struggled against temptation until a more desperate acquaintance came along. He remembered the landlord of the inn where he had lunched, telling him of an ugly quarrying village he would pass through, a nest of out-of-works, owing to quarries unprofitable at the high rate of wages being closed down, living discontented Bolshevik lives on high out-of-work pay. He cursed his leg. If it had not failed him, he would have got home on the first man as easily as shaking hands. The flabby, unguarded face shimmered in front of him, and then he could have turned his attention to the man in khaki slacks, a true loafer type, spiritless when alone. The kind of man who, if he had worn those slacks in the army, would have been in guard-room every week, would have cowered as a perpetual cleaner of latrines under the eyes of vitriol-tongued sergeants. Far from a fighting man, his imagination worked almost pleasurably in the reconstitution of the robbery. But for his abominable leg he would have downed both the degenerate scoundrels and have recovered his precious belongings. He damned them and his leg impartially. The watch and chain were all that he had kept materially of Olivia. In the morning he had hesitated as to the advisability of carrying them with him, gold watches and chains not being customary accoutrements of a common sailor in windjammer or tramp steamer forecastle. But sentiment had prevailed. He could hide them somewhere when he reached the port, and at convenient slop-shops he could have reorganized attire and equipment. The rain pattered on the open road, came dribbling through the branches of the pines. He cursed the rain. He must go on somewhere. Absurd to stay in the wood and get wet through. He struggled to his feet, and then for the first time became aware of a looseness around his middle. He looked down. His trousers were unbuttoned. His shirt sagged out immodestly, as if the front had been hurriedly tucked in. His hands sought his waist. The belt, with all the money he had in the world, had gone. End of chapter 23. Chapter 24 of The Tale of Triona by William John Locke. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 24. It was close on midnight when a car grated and stopped in front of the little Georgian house in Pendish, and the truant stumbled through the door, left open, into the presence of Mrs. Pettiland, who was anxiously awaiting him. He was wet through, dishevelled, exhausted. He was shivering with cold, and his face was like the mask of a ghost. She met him in the passage and dragged him into the little sea-haunted parlour. "Oh, what have you been doing?" She had been worried all day, unable to account for the money, a month's rent and board in advance, in the envelope addressed to her. "Didn't I tell you not to overdo yourself?" He greeted her upbraidings with a laugh of bravado. "I set out today on my last adventure. This is the end of it. I'm here for the rest of time." "You'll be in the churchyard for the rest of eternity if you don't go to bed at once," she declared. She packed into his room, fussed motherwise about him, dosed him with ammoniated quinine, stuck hot water bottles in his bed, stood over him with hot Bovril with an egg in it. She prescribed whisky, also hot, but since the fatal night at Rowington's dinner party he had abjured alcohol. "Now perhaps you'll tell me what has happened," she said. "My game live gave out when I got to some quarries. I believe the beastly place is called Woorow." "Woorow? Why, that's the other side of the county." She looked at him aghast. "Do you mean to say that you walked to Woorow in your state? Really, men oughtn't to be allowed to run about loose." "I have run about loose since I was 14, said he. "And a pretty mess you seem to have made of it. And then what did you do?" She took away the cup of Bovril and poached egg which he had devoured ravenously, to her womanly satisfaction, and handed him another. He continued his story, recounting it between spoonfuls in his imaginative way. When he found he could go no further, he curled up to sleep in a wood. When things went wrong, he assured her, there was nothing like going to sleep in a wood. All the pixies and elves and rabbits and stoats and weasels came and sat round you in a magic circle, shielding you from harm. "What would have happened to the babes in the wood," he cried, "if it hadn't been for the robins?" "I wonder what your temperature is," said Mrs. Petterland. "Normal," said he. "This is the first hour I've been normal for months." "I'll take it before I leave you," she said. "Well, you went to sleep?" "Yes, he slept like an enchanted dog. He woke up 4 hours afterwards to find it pouring with rain. What could he do? He had to get back. Walking with his rotten old leg was out of the question. In the daytime a decent-looking pedestrian may have the chance of stopping a motoring Good Samaritan, and with a tale of sudden lameness get a lift by the side of the chauffeur. But at night it was impossible. To stand with the resting arms outspread in front of the hell-lamps of an advancing car would be an act of suicidal desperation. No, he had returned by all sorts of stages. He had almost forgotten them. A manure cart had brought him some way. Then he had gone dot and carry one for a mile. Then something else. He could only hail slow-moving traffic in the wet and darkness. Then he spent an endless time in the cab of a steam traction engine, which he had abandoned on seeing a 2-seater car with flaring headlamps stationed at a cottage gate. The old campaigner's instinct, Mrs. Petterland. What should it be but a doctor's car outside a poor little cottage? And as the headlamps were pointing to where I had come from, I concluded he had drawn up and would turn round and go where I wanted to get to." "And was it a doctor?" He laughed. Of course it was. He had taken shelter from the rain under the hood of the car for an hour. Then, when the cottage door opened, he had scrambled out and waited for the owner. There had been a few words of explanation. By luck, it was Dr. Stansfield of Fanstead. "Dr. Stansfield? Why, of course. He knows you inside and out. A charming fellow. He dropped me here, or rather, I dropped him. And he never came in to look after you, a man in your condition. I'll give him a piece of my mind when I see him." He soothed the indignant lady. The good doctor was unaware that anything particular was wrong with him. Poor man, he'd been on the go since 5 o'clock the previous evening. Human beings are born inconsiderate of the feelings of others, and he was dog-tired. Too dog-tired even to argue. He would have given a lift to Judas Iscariot or the leper of Aosta, so long as he wasn't worried. "He nearly pitched us over at a curve called Hell's Corner, you know. The near front wheel was just an inch off the edge. And then he stopped dead and flung his hands over his eyes and said, 'Oh, my God!' He had lost his nerve. Then, when I told him I had driven everything from a general's Rolls-Royce to an armoured car all over Russia in the war, he let me take the wheel. And that's the whole thing." He chatted boyishly, in high spirits, and smoked a cigarette. Mrs. Petterland went for a clinical thermometer. To her secret disappointment, his temperature was only just above normal. She would have loved to keep him in bed a few days and have the proper ordering of him. A woman loves to have an amazing fool of a man at her mercy, especially if she is gifted with a glimmer of humour. When she left him, he laughed out loud. Well, he'd had his adventure with a vengeance. A real old will-o'-the-wisp chase, which had landed him, as ever, into disaster. Yet it had been worth it, every bit, until his leg gave out on the quarry hill. Even his lumber he did not regret. His miserable journey back, recalling old days, had its points. It was good to get the better of circumstances. As to his money, which was to have started him in life among coral reefs and conch shells, that had gone irretrievably. Of course he could have gone to the nearest police station, but if the miscreants were arrested, he would have to prosecute. Highway robbery was a serious affair. The stolen belt packed with banknotes, a romantic one. The trial would provide a good newspaper story. There would be most undesirable publicity, and publicity is the last thing a man dead to the world would desire. He shrugged philosophic shoulders. Let the money go. The humour of the situation tickled his vagabond fancy. He was penniless. That was the comical end of his pursuit of the ignis fatuus. The freak finality and inevitability of it stimulated his sense of the romantic. If he had been possessed of real courage, he would have made over all his money months ago to Olivia and disappeared, as he was now, into the unknown. His experience of life ought to have taught him the inexorable fatality of compromise. What would he do? He did not know. Drowsy after the day's fatigue, and very warm and comfortable, he did not care. He curled himself up in the bed and went to sleep. One afternoon, a week afterwards, he limped into Mrs. Pettiland's post office with a gay air. "Mrs. Pettiland," said he, "at last I have found my true vocation." "I'm glad to hear it, sir," she replied, undisturbed in her official duties, which consisted in taking the coppers from a small child in payment for 2 stamps. "You've been rather restless these last few days." Triona watched the child depart, clasping the stamps in a clammy hand. When one hasn't a penny in the world, and starvation stares you in the face, one may be excused for busy search for a means of livelihood. "You've got plenty of money." "I haven't." "You paid me a month's board and lodging in advance the other day. Though why you did it I can't understand." "I was going to run away," he said cheerfully. "To compensate you in that miserable manner for inconvenience was the least I could do. But the gods rightly stepped in and hauled me back." He swung himself on the counter and smiled at her. "I'm a fraud, you know." The plump and decorous lady could not realize his earnestness. Behind his words lay some jest which she could not fathom. "You don't believe me?" He sighed. If he had told her a fairy tale, she, like all the rest of the world in his past life, would have believed him. Now that he told the truth, he met with blank incredulity. "I'm going to earn my living. I'm taking on a job as a chauffeur." She stared at him. "A chauffeur? You?" "Yes, why not?" Her mind ran over his intellectual face, his clothes, his manners, his talk, free and sometimes disconcertingly elusive, like that of the rare and impeccably introduced artists whom she had lodged. His books. "Why, you're a gentleman," she gasped. "Oh, no, not really. I've been all kinds of things in my time. Among them I've passed as a gentleman. But by trade I'm a chauffeur. I practically started life as a chauffeur, in Russia. For years I drove a Russian prince all over Europe. Now there aren't any more Russian princes, I'm going to drive the good people of Fanstead to railway stations and dinner parties." "Well, I never," said Mrs. Pettiland. "There's a young man, an ex-officer, Radnor by name, in Fanstead, who's just set up a motor garage." "He'll fail," said Mrs. Pettiland. "They all do. Old Hetherington of the Bull has all the custom." "With one rickety death trap for hire, and a fool of a mechanic who has wrecked every car sent in for repairs for a radius of 30 miles. I offered Hetherington to teach him his business. He might as well sing Il Trovatore to a mule. So I went to Radnor. He had just sacked a man, and with my invariable luck I stepped in at the right moment. No, Mrs. Pettiland." He swung his sound leg and looked at her, enjoying her mystification. "The reign of Hetherington is over. Radnor's garage is going to be the wonder of the countryside." He believed it implicitly. Radnor, a mild and worried young man, with quite a sound knowledge of his business, might struggle along and earn a hands-to-mouth living, but he lacked driving power. To Triona, during his 2 or 3 interviews with him, that was obvious. He had sufficient capital for a start, a good garage equipment, a fairly modest 25 HP utility car, and was trying to make up his mind to buy another. Triona divined his irresolution. He would be at the mercy of unscrupulous mechanics and chauffeurs. His spirit seemed to have been broken by 2 years' imprisonment in Germany. He had lost the secret of command. And by nature a modest, retiring gentleman, Triona pitied him. He had wandered through the west of England seeking a pitch where the competition was not too fierce, and finding unprogressive Fanstead, had invested all his capital in the business. He had been there a couple of months, during which very little work had come in. He could stick it out for 6 months more. After that, the deluge. "Give me £4 a week as head mechanic and chauffeur," said Triona, "and the deluge will be golden rain." This was after the exhibition of John Briggs' papers, Armoured Car Column and Minesweeper, and the tale of his Russian chauffeurdom. He had also worked magic, having a diagnostician's second sight into the insides of a car's mechanism with a mysteriously broken down 40 HP foreign car, the only one in the garage for repairs, which, apparently flawless, owner and chauffeur and Radnor himself regarded with hepitude. "I'll take you on all right," said Radnor, "but surely a man like you ought to be running a show of his own." "I haven't a cent in the world," replied Triona, "so I can't." All this he told Mrs. Petland, swinging his sound leg as he sat on the counter. "The only fly in the ointment," said he, "is that I shall have to move." "From here? Whatever for?" "Chauffeurs don't have luxurious bed-sitting rooms with specially designed scenery for views. They can't afford it. Besides, they're not desirable lodgers." She flushed indignantly. If he thought she would prefer his room to his company because he drove a car, he was very much mistaken. The implication hurt. Even suppose he was fit to look after a car, he was not yet fit to look after himself. Witness his folly of a week ago. He would pay her whatever he could afford, and she would be more than contented. "What wonderful people there are in the world," he sighed. But he withstood her generous blandishments. No, there was an eternal fitness of things. Besides, he must live at the garage, ready to attend telephone calls by day or by night. He couldn't be hobbling backwards and forwards between Fanstead and Pendish. Against the practical side of the question there could be no argument. "And what shall I do with the money you've paid in advance?" "Keep it for a while," said he. "Perhaps Randall will give me the sack, and I'll come creeping back to you." Thus did Triona, with bag and baggage, take up his quarters in an attic loft in the garage yard at Fanstead. Not since his flight from Olivia had he felt so free of care. Fate had condemned him to the backwater, and in the backwater he would pass his contented life, a life of truth and honesty. And he had before him an essential to his soul's health, an ideal. He would inspire the spiritless with spirit, the ineffectual with efficiency, the sick heart with health. The man Radnor had deserved well of his country through gallant service, wounds, and imprisonment. His country had given him the military cross and a lieutenant's gratuity, and told him not to worry it any more. If Mrs. Petland's prophecy came true, and he failed, he would be cast upon a country that wouldn't be worried. Triona swore that he would pull through. He would save a fellow man from shipwreck without his knowledge. It was something to live for. He became once more the perfect chauffeur, the enthusiastic motorman, dreaming of a great garage, a sort of palace of automobiles for the west of England. And, as he dreamed, so did it begin to come to pass. The efficiency of the Quantock garage became known for miles around. Owners of valuable cars forsook the professional wreckers in the great junction town and sent them to Fanstead. Radnor soon bought his second car. By the end of the autumn, a third car, and increased his staff. Triona was foreman mechanician. Had he not so desired, he need not have driven, nor need he have driven in the brass-buttoned livery on which he insisted that Radnor's chauffeurs should be attired. Smartness, he argued rightly, caught the eye and imagination. But he loved the wheel. Driving cooled the vagabond fire in his veins. There was an old touring car of high horsepower, excellent when nursed with loving hand and understanding heart, but a box of dismal caprice to the inexpert, which he would allow no one to drive but himself. Radnor held the thing in horror and wanted to sell it as a bad bargain. He had had it out once, and it had broken down 10 miles from home, and had suffered the ignominy of a tow back. Triona wrought at it for 3 weeks, conjuring up spare parts from nowhere, and fitting to it new devices, and turned out a going concern in which he took inordinate pride. He whirled touring parties prodigious distances in this once rickety creation of his adoption. He could get 35 or 40 out of her easily. "All right, it's your funeral, not mine," said Randall during one of their discussions. It was a healthy life. His lameness did not matter. Whatever internal lesions he suffered from gave no symptoms of existence. His face lost its lines of suffering, his eyes their shifty haggardness. He put on flesh, as far as is possible for a naturally spare-built man. Radnor, an honourable soul, when the business in the new year showed proof of immense development, offered him a substantial increase in salary. But Triona refused. "What do I want with money, my dear fellow? If I had more, I'd only spend it for books, and I've more of them now than I know where to put them. No, keep all you can for capital in the business, or stick it into an advertisement scheme I've been working out." "You're an odd devil, Briggs," said Radnor. He was a small, dark man with great mournful eyes and a little clipped moustache over a timorous mouth, and his lips were always twitching. "A queer devil. What I should have done without you I don't know. If I could do what I want, I should offer you a partnership." "Oh, don't be a damn fool," said Triona. "A partner puts in money, and I haven't a bean. Besides, if I were a partner, the whole show would go to hell." "Why?" "I should immediately want to go and do something else," replied Triona. "I give it up," said Radnor. "Best thing you can do," said Triona. How could the very grateful young proprietor divine the spiritual crankiness of his foreman? He went through the English equivalent of shoulder-shrugging. Briggs, from the business point of view, was a treasure fallen from heaven, and Briggs was a mystery. He didn't begin to pretend to understand Briggs. Briggs obviously didn't want to be understood. Radnor was a gentleman. He could press the matter no further. "Let us get this business up to a net profit of 3,000 a year, and then we may talk," said Triona. 3,000? Good God, man, I couldn't talk. I'd slobber and gibber." "That's where I'll come in," laughed Triona. He'd set his heart on this washout from the war making good. Just before Christmas he had an added incentive. A melancholy lady and a wistful, pretty girl had flashed for a week-end through Fanstead. They'd come from London and had put up at the King's Head. Radnor had made the tour of the proprietor through the garage. "This is Mr. Briggs, my foreman, whom I've so often told you about." And afterwards, to Triona with an air of inconsequence, "A kind of aunt and cousin of mine who wanted to see how I was getting on." Poor old chap, of course they wanted to see how he was getting on. The girl's assessing eyes took in everything, himself included. The unbidden phrase flashed through his brain. He should marry the girl by Michaelmas Day. The sudden impishness of it delighted him. "By God, he shall," he swore to himself. So he refused an increase of salary, and by following an ignis fatuus of an ideal, he kept his conscience in a state of interested amusement at the mystification of his employer. April came and found the Quantock garage in full tide of business. Hetherington of the Bull had long since given up his wheezy station car and the motor-destroying works in which he housed it. Triona laboured from morning to night, for a while content to see the wheels of an efficient establishment go round. And then he began to grow restless. He had set Radnor permanently on his feet. If he left, the business would go on by its own momentum. Nothing more was needed than Radnor's own conscientious plodding. Why should he stay? He had achieved his purpose. Radnor would surely be in a financial position warranting him to marry the girl by Michaelmas. "I'll see him through," he vowed, and stayed on. And then? And then? Life once more became a blank. Of late he had drugged lonely and despairing thoughts by reading. Books grew into great piles in corners of his loft above the garage. But reading awoke him to the poignant craving for expression. He had 6 tantalizing plots for novels in his head, a score of great situations, a novelist's gallery of vivid personalities. As to the latter, he had a superstition. If he gave one a name, it would arise in flesh and blood, insistent on having its story told. So he shut tempting names resolutely from his brain, for he made up his queer mind never to write another line of romance. The spring stirred the sap within him. It was a year now since he had fled from Olivia. What was she doing? What feeling? Occasionally he called on Mrs. Petland. Mara, he learnt, had paid her weekly visit in October, had occupied his old room, had gone to visit her lunatic husband, had maintained her impenetrable silence as to her mistress's doings. When Mrs. Petland had reported his chauffeur activities, Mara had said, "I'm glad he's got honest employment." "Shall I let him know that you're here?" Mrs. Petland had asked. Mara had answered in her final way, "I've no desire to see him, and he certainly has no desire to see me." Mara therefore had come and gone without his knowledge. Often he wished that he had met her and wrung some information from her unwilling lips. And now, with his purpose accomplished, his heart aching for change, his spirit craving to pour itself out in tumultuous words, and his soul crying for her that was lost, the thought that had haunted the back of his mind for the past year stood out grimly, spectre-wise. What right had he to live? Olifant had spoken truly. What right had he to compel her to perpetual widowhood that was no widowhood? She was tied to him, her husband lost, as far as she was concerned, to human ken, never to cross her path again. Tied to him as much as Mara was tied to the poor wretch in the madhouse. And as Mara had grown soured and hard, so might Olivia grow. Olivia, so young now, with all the joy of life before her. He gone, she could marry again. There was Olifant, that model of men, whom he guessed to have supplanted. With him she could be happy until her life's end. Once more she could be Lady Bountiful of the Towers. The conception was an agony of the flesh, keeping him awake of nights on the hard little camp bed in the loft. He grappled with the torture, resolved to triumph over it, as he had gritted his teeth and triumphed over physical pain in hospitals. The knife was essential, he told himself. It was for her sake. It was his duty to put himself out of the world. And yet the days went on, and he felt the lust of life in his blood. The question tauntingly arose. Is it braver to die than to live? Is it more cowardly to live than to die? He couldn't answer it. In the meantime he went on mending broken-down motor engines and driving gay tourists about the countryside in his car of resurrection. End of chapter 24. Chapter 25 of The Tale of Triona by William John Locke. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 25. What was bound to happen had happened. Olifant, the Galahad, out for Grails, as Triona and indeed as Olivia had pictured him, had lost his head, poured out a flow of mad words, and flung his arms around her and kissed her passionately. She had been caught, had half surrendered. Released, she put hands to a tumultuous bosom and staggered away from him. And there had followed a scene enacted for the 20 billionth time on the world's stage. She had grown weak and strong by turns. At last she had said, "If you love me, go now and let me think it over and all that it means." And he had gone, passion yielding to his courteous consideration of her, and she was left alone in the drawing-room, staring through the open French windows at the May garden. Since her return from the south of France she had felt the thing coming. In October, as soon as Mara had returned from her holiday, fear had driven her from Medlow. The hunger in the man's eyes proclaimed an impossible situation. The guest and host position she had changed after the first few weeks. Brother and sister and herself kept house together, on the face of it a sensible and economical arrangement. Mr. Trivett and Mr. Fenmarch, once more financial advisers, commended it with enthusiasm. The summer had passed happily enough. The modus vivendi, with the sections of Medlow society respectively symbolized by Lansdowne House and Blair Park, had arranged itself automatically. She found conferred upon her the freedom of each. The essential snobbery of English life is a myth kept alive by our enemies. It is true that the squire and the linen-draper do not ask each other and their families to dinner. Their social worlds are apart. They don't want to ask each other to dinner. They would never dream of asking each other to dinner, one no more than the other. They respect each other too mightily. But a dweller in both worlds, such as Olivia, triveted and galed though she was on the one side, yet on the other the wife of the famous Alexis Triona and the friend of the Olifants, folks whose genealogy was lost somewhere in a Pictish bonfire of archives, can wander up and down the whole social gamut at her good pleasure. Besides, she herself does not mix the incompatible. A mere question of the art of life, which Olivia, with her London experiences, found easy of resolution. So, in the mild and mellow way on which Medlow prided itself, she danced and tennised and picnicked in the summer through. On the Blair Park side, she wondered laughingly at their unsupercilious noses, Blaise Olifant and his sister accompanied her in the gentle festivities. Each day had brought its petty golden dust, the futile church bazaar, the tennis tournament, the whist drive of which old John Freak, the linen-draper father of Lydia, had made her a lady patroness, the motor run into quaint Shrewsbury, on shopping adventure in quest of crab or lobster unobtainable in Medlow. 1,000 trivial activities, to the innocent choking of her soul, to use Matthew Arnold's figure, and an inevitable forgetfulness. Everything had gone well until October. Then she had taken prudent flight with Mara to the France and Italy which she had never seen, and there she had stayed till the beginning of May. It was Mrs. Woolcombe who assisted on her return to Medlow. Where else should she return after her wanderings but to her own home? At first everything was just as it used to be. Then, on a trivial cause, an insult offered her by an Italian in Venice which she had laughingly recounted, the passion of Blaise Olifant had suddenly flamed forth. She was frightened, shaken. He had given her the thrill which in her early relations with him she had half contemptuously deemed impossible. She found herself free from sense of outrage. She bore him no resentment. Indeed, she had responded to his kiss. She was not sure within herself whether she would not respond again. The communicated thrill completed her original conception of him as the very perfect gentle knight. For after all, knights without red blood in their veins might be gentle, but scarcely perfect. If she were free, she would marry him out of hand, without further question. He had always dwelt in a tender spot of her heart. Now he had slipped into one more warm, smouldering with strange fires. But she was not free. She stood at once at the parting of the roads. She must go back to a wandering or lonely life, or she must defy conventions. She went out into the ivy-walled garden, and walked up the central path, between the beds of wallflowers and forget-me-nots and the standard roses just bursting into leaf. What could she do? Once she had laughed scornfully at the idea of love playing any part in her life. She had not reckoned with her youth, and now she stared aghast at the vista of lonely and loveless years. Presently Blaise Olifant came from his study and advanced to meet her. He said, "Can you speak to me now?" "Yes, now," she answered. "I've behaved like any blackguard. You must forgive me if you can. The Italian cad who made me see red was not very much worse than myself." There was a smile in her dark eyes as she looked up at him. "There's all the difference in the world. I disliked the Italian very much." She touched his sleeve. "You are forgiven, my dear friend. It's all my fault. I oughtn't to have come back." "You're the most wonderful of women," said he. The most wonderful of women made a little wry movement of her lips. "It's all a might be and a can't be," she said in a low voice. "Do you suppose, my dear, I don't know that? If it could be, do you think I should regret losing my self-control?" She said, "If it's any consolation to you, perhaps I lost mine too. We're both human. Perhaps a woman is even more so than a man. That's why I went away in October. Things were getting impossible." "Good God!" he exclaimed. "I thought you were bored to death." A little laugh could not be restrained. The blindness of man to psychological phenomena is ever a subject for women's sweet or bitter mirth. But it was not in his heart to respond. "Then you do care for me a little?" "I shouldn't be standing here with you now if I didn't. I shouldn't have made the mistake of coming back if I hadn't wanted to see you." "Mistake?" He sighed and turned a step away. "Yes, I suppose it was. I should have been frank with Mary and shown her that it was impossible for me." "It would be best for me to go to-morrow," said Olivia. "Where?" "London, a hotel, any old branch." She smiled. "I must settle down somewhere sooner or later. The sooner the better." "That's monstrous," he declared with a flash in his eyes. "To turn you out of your home, I should feel a scoundrel." "I don't see how we can go on living together, carrying on as usual, as though nothing has happened." For a few moments they walked up the gravelled path in silence, both bareheaded in the mild May sunshine. "Listen," he said, coming to a pause. "I'm a man who has learned self-control in 3 hard schools: my Scotch fathers, science, war. If I swear to you on my honour that nothing that has passed between us today shall ever be revived by me in look or word or act, will you stay with us and give me your friendship, your companionship, your presence in the house? It was an aching desert all the time you were away." She walked on a pace or two, after a hopeless sigh. Could she never drive into this unworldly head the fact that women were not sexless angels? How could their eyes for ever meet in the glance of a polite couple discussing the weather across a tea-table? She could not resist a shaft of mockery. "For all of your philosopher father and science and war, I wonder, my dear Blaise, how much you really know of life." He halted and put a hand on her slim shoulder. "I love you so much, my dear," said he, "that I should be content to hang crucified before you, so that my eyes could rest upon you till I died." He turned and strode fast away. She followed him, crying, "Blaise, Blaise!" He half turned with an arresting arm, and even at that moment she was touched by the pathos of the other empty sleeve. "No, don't, please." She ran hard, and, facing him, blocked his way. "But what of me? What of my feelings when I saw you hanging crucified?" That point of view had not occurred to him. He looked at her, embarrassed. His Scottish veracity asserted itself. "When a man's mad in love," said he can't think of everything." She took his arm and led him up the gravelled path again. "Don't you see, my dear, how impossible it all is?" "Yes, I suppose so. It must be one thing or the other, and all that is good and true and honourable makes it the other." Tears came at the hopelessness of it. She seized his hand in both of hers. "What you said just now is a thing no woman could forget till the day of her death." She kissed the hand and let it drop, stirred to the inmost. What was she, ineffectual failure, to command the love of such a man? He stood for a while, looking into the vacancy of the pale blue sky over the ivy-clad wall. Before her eyes, garden and house and wall and sky were blotted out, and only the one tall figure existed in the scene. Her heart beat. It was a moment of peril, and the moment seemed like an hour. At last he turned and looked at her with his grave smile. She put her hand on her heart, not knowing whether to cry or laugh for the relaxation of tension. "You stay here with Mary," he said gently. "I'll go away for a change. A holiday. I need one. There's an old uncle of mine in Scotland. I've neglected him and his salmon fishing shamefully for years. How I can fish with one arm, heaven only knows. I've learned to do most things. It'll be a new experience. As a matter of fact, I should have gone last month if the temptation to wait for you hadn't been so strong. It's up in the wilds of Inverness." She made feeble protest. It was she who drove him out of his home. Far better for her to cut herself adrift from Medlow. But he prevailed. He would go. In the meantime, things might right themselves. He departed the following morning, leaving Olivia to a new sense of loneliness and unrest. She lived constantly in the tense moment, catching her breath at the significance of its possibilities. Unbidden and hateful, the question recurred. If positions had been reversed, if Blaise had been the lost husband and Alexis the lover, would Alexis have let her go? certainly not Alexis. And yet, deep down in her heart, she was grateful that she had come scatheless through the moment. The little round of country gaieties went on, and caught her up in its mild gyrations. Mrs. Woolcombe deplored her brother's absence. He had been looking forward to the social life with Olivia, especially the tennis parties. It was wonderful how he had overcome the handicap of his one arm. The effectual service he had perfected, tossing up the ball with his racket and smiting it at the dead point of ascent. It had all been due to Olivia's encouragement the previous summer, for till then he had not played for years. But he had been sadly overworked. When a man cannot sleep and rises up in the morning with a band of iron round his head, it is obvious that he needs a change. It was the best thing for Blaise, undoubtedly, but it must be dull for Olivia. So spake Mary Woolcombe, unaware of kisses and tense moments. Olivia said to Mara, "This is an idle, meaningless life. We'll go back to London and settle down." "Will life mean much more when you get there?" asked Mara. "I can do something." "What?" "How do I know? Why are you so irritating, Mara?" "It isn't me," said Mara. "What is it, then?" "A woman wants a man to look after," said Mara, in her unimpassioned way. "If she can't get a man, she wants a woman. I've got you, so I'm not irritated. You haven't got either, so you are." Olivia flushed angrily and swerved round in her chair before the mirror on her toilet table. Mara was drying her hair, as she had dried it from days before Olivia could remember. "That's a liberty, Mara, which you oughtn't to have taken." "I dare say, dearie," replied Mara, unmoved, "but it's good for you that somebody now and then should tell you the truth." "I want neither man nor woman," Olivia declared. Mara gently squared her mistress's shoulders to the mirror and went on with her task. "I wonder," she said. "I think you're hateful," said Olivia. "Maybe, but I've got common sense. If you think you're going to London to stand for Parliament, or write poetry and get it printed, or run a home for incurable camels, you're mistaken, dear, and you'll have no truck with women. You've never had a woman friend in the world, anyone you'd die for." "Of course I haven't," snapped Olivia. "It's a man's woman you are," continued Mara. "You've looked after men ever since your dear mother was ill. It's what God meant you to do. It's all you can do. And you haven't got a man, and that's what makes you unhappy." Olivia sprang from her chair, looking with her long black hair ruffled and frizzed and spreading out around her worn oval face like an angry sea nymph on a rock disputed by satyrs. "I hate men and everything connected with them." "You still hate your husband?" asked Mara, looking at her with cold, pale eyes. "I loathe him. How dare you? Haven't I forbidden you to mention his name?" "I didn't mention his name," said Mara. "But if you like, I won't refer to him again. Sit down and let me put on the electric dryer. Your hair's still wringing wet." She yielded, not with good grace. Mara had her at her mercy. Dignity counselled instant dismissal of Mara from her presence. But the washing and drying of her long thick hair had ever been a problem, so dignity gave way to comfort. She was furious with Mara. We all are with people who confront us with the naked truth about ourselves. That was all she was fit for, all that life had taught her, to look after a man. She stared at the blatant proposition in the grimness of the night watches. What else in God's name was she capable of doing for an inch advancement of humanity? She had gone forth long ago, so it seemed, from Medlow, to open the mysterious mysteries of the world. She had opened them, and all the pearls, good, bad, and indifferent, were men. All the ideals, all the colour and music and gorgeous edifices of life, all the world vibration of thought and action and joy of which she had dreamed, every manifold thrill that had run through her being from feet to hair on that first night in London when she leaned out of her Victoria Street flat and opened her young soul to the informing spirit of the vast city of mystery. The whole spiritual meaning, nay, the whole material reason for her existence, was resolved into one exquisitely pure, bafflingly translucent in its mystery of shooting flames, utterly elemental crystal of sex. Sex in its supreme purity, but sex all the same. She was a man's woman. It was at once a glory and a degradation, Mara was right. What woman in the course of her life had she cared a scrap for? Her mother. Her mother was a religion. And men? Her chastity revolted. When had she sought to attract men? Her conscience was clear. But men had been the terror, the interest, the delight of her life from the moment she had left the cloistral walls of her home. And even before that, on a different plane, had she not, while keeping house for father and brothers, always thought in terms of man? And now she was doing the same. The emptiness of her prospective life in London appalled her. The mad liar, her husband, an unseizable, unknown entity, of whom she thought with shivering repulsion, was away somewhere, living a strange, unveracious life. The soldier, scholar, and gentleman who loved her, into whose arms, into whose life she had all but fallen, had fled, saving her from perils. Before he returned, she must, in decency and honour, take up her solitary abode elsewhere, or else she could terminate his tenancy of the Towers and carry on an old maidish life in Medlow for evermore. Anyway, a useless, sexless thing for all eternity. The second poster brought her some letters, a few bills and receipts, a note from Janet Finnemore, with whom she kept up a casual correspondence, and a long, untidy screed from Lydia. Lydia had conceived the idea of visiting Medlow. Her father, old John Freak, whom she had not seen for years, was ailing. What did Olivia think of the notion? Olivia, sitting in the little ivy-clad summer-house at the end of the garden, thought less of the notion than of the amazing lady. To ask her, an outsider, whether she should come to her father's bed of sickness? She made up her mind to write, "Oh yes, come at once, but wear the thickest of black veils so that no one will recognize you." Her mind wandered away from the hypothetical visit. London and Lydia again? Just where she was when she started. Life seemed a hopeless muddle. "I'm sorry," said Mara's voice, breaking suddenly on her meditations. She looked up and beheld Mara more than usually grave and cold. "I'm sorry to disturb you, but I've just had a letter. He's dead." Olivia, with a shock through all her being, started to her feet. "Dead? My husband?" "No," said Mara. "Mine." "Oh," said Olivia, somewhat breathless, and sank on the bench again. She recovered herself quickly. "I'm sorry, Mara, but after all it's a merciful release." "God's mercies are inscrutable," said Mara. So, thought Olivia, was Mara's remark. "I've always loved him, you see," said Mara. "I suppose you'll have no objections to my going to bury him?" "My dear old Mara," cried Olivia, "of course, my dear, you can go. Go whenever you like." "I'll come back as soon as it's over," said Mara. She turned and walked away, and Olivia saw her lean and unexpressive shoulders rise as though a sob had shaken her. End of chapter 25. Chapter 26 of The Tale of Triona by William John Locke. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 26. Of the death of Mara Stebbing's husband, and of her second appearance in Pendish during his sojourn in the West Country, Triona knew nothing. Again she had forbidden her sister-in-law to give him any information as to her doings. Again she disclaimed interest in the young man. Nor was he aware, a week after the funeral, that Mara, who had stood by the graveside in the pouring rain, and had insisted on jogging back to Pendish wet through in the undertaker's brougham, lay dangerously ill in the upstairs bedroom of the little Georgian house. The increasing business of the Quantock garage diverted his energies from polite tramps into Pendish to inquire into Mrs. Pettiland's state of health. Also, he was growing morose, his soul feeding on itself, and beginning to develop an unwholesome misanthropy. Like Hamlet, man didn't delight him. No, nor woman either. When not working in the garage or driving the old touring car, he retired to brood in his loft and eschewed the company of his kind. "You're overdoing it," said Radnor, a kindly person. "Why not go away on a holiday and have a change?" "Only one change would do me any good," he replied gloomily, "and that would be to get out of this particularly vile universe." Radnor looked round his well-ordered, bustling establishment and smiled. "It isn't as bad as all that." Triona shrugged his shoulders, and, spanner in hand, turned to the car he was doctoring without a reply. A few days afterwards Radnor said, "We're going to be married in August. I don't mind saying it's mostly thanks to you." "I'm glad to hear it," said Triona. "I'll stick it out till then." "And then?" "I'll have the change you've been talking of." Radnor laughed. "You let me have a bit of a honeymoon first, won't you?" "Oh, yes," replied Triona. "You can have your honeymoon." The weakening incentive to life would last till September. He would make it last. It was now the beginning of June. 3 months or so wouldn't matter. To carry on a meaningless existence further would be absurd. Indeed, it would be immoral. Of that, for some time past, he had convinced himself. England ran motor mad that summer. It awoke to find war restrictions removed, roads free, and petrol to be had for the buying. In its eagerness to race through a beloved land closed up for years, and view or review historic spots of loveliness, and otherwise to indulge in its national vagabond humour, it cared little for the price of petrol. The hiring garages, in anything like tourist centres, found their resources strained. Radnor bought another car, and still had more orders than he could execute. He drove one car himself. It was a soft June evening. He drove slowly. Lease of life, driving homewards from the neighbourhood of the great junction town. He had taken a merry party that day, some 150 miles through the tenderest greenery of early summer, through dark gorges with startling shadows, through cool lanes, over hills in the open sunshine, and in the sweetness of the evening he put them down at the place whence they had started. For all his mood of despair, he had enjoyed the day. The poet in him had responded to the eternal call of the year's life, laughing in its gay insolence of youth. Since 9 in the morning the sweet wind of the hills had swept through his lungs, and scenes of loveliness had shimmered before his eyes. Alone at the wheel, he thought of the passing day of beauty. Was it not worth living, just to enjoy it? Was it not worth living, just to translate into words, if only for the sake of doing, the emotion of that enjoyment? He had passed through a beechwood, a world of pale emerald, like fairy seas above and a shimmer of bluebells below, as though the sky had been lain down for a carpet. He drove slowly and carefully. The car had done its good day's work. It was knocking a bit, like an old horse wheezing in protest against overestimation of its enduring powers. He had tried it perhaps too high today. He loved the recreated old car as though it were a living thing. A valiant old car which had raced over awful roads in Flanders. It was a crazy irritation that he could not pat it into comfort. Nursing it with the mechanician's queer tenderness, he came to the straight mile, near home, of road on the mountain-side, with its sheer drop into the valley, ending at the turn known as Hell's Corner, at which the overwrought doctor on the night of mad adventure had lost his nerve. Just past the corner branched the secondary road to Fansted, for the great road swept on by the expiring end of Pendish village. But by walking from Pendish, as he had done on the day of the aforesaid adventure, through lanes and fields, one cut off a great bend of road and stuck it on the fair mile beyond the turn. And now, a few hundred yards from the corner, the engine gave trouble. He descended from his seat and opened the bonnet. He discovered a simple matter, the choking of a plug. The knocking, he knew, was in the cardan shaft. He would have to replace the worn pin. While cleaning out the choked plug with a piece of wire and blowing through it to clear it from the last fragment of grit, he wondered how long it would take to have the spare pin made. He was going out again the day after tomorrow. Could he risk the old car? Tomorrow he would take her down and see for himself the full extent of the trouble. Meanwhile he screwed the plug on again, shut down the bonnet, cranked up the starting handle, and jumped up beside the wheel. But just as he put in the low gear, his eyes were riveted on a familiar figure some 20 yards away, walking towards him. For a moment or two he remained paralysed, while the old-fashioned gears crunched horribly. There she advanced, slim, erect, in Tussauds silk coat and a skirt, a flash of red bow at the opening of her blouse. The car began to move. At that instant their eyes met. Olivia staggered back, and he read in her bewildered gaze the same horror he had last seen in her eyes. What she was doing here on this strip of remote road he could not understand. Obviously she had not expected to find him, for she looked at him as though he were some awful ghost. He changed gear, went full speed ahead, and passed her in a flash. Then suddenly the command of doom shot through his brain. This was the end. Now was the end that should have come, had he not been a coward, months ago. He deliberately swerved off the road and went hurtling over the hillside. Olivia, staring, wide-eyed, wondering at the racing car, saw it happen. It was no accident. It was deliberate. Her brain reeled at the sudden and awful horror. She swayed to the bank and fainted. A two-seater car, a young man and woman in it, came upon her a few moments later and drew up. The woman ministered to her, and presently she revived. "There has been a horrible accident," she explained haggardly. "A car went over. You can see the wheel marks. Oh, my God!" She pointed. A column of smoke was rising from the valley into the still evening air. She scrambled to unsteady feet and started to run. The young man detained her. "The car will take us quicker. Maggie, you drive. I'll stand on the footboard." They swiftly covered the 100 yards or so to the scene of the catastrophe. And there, 30 feet below in the ravine, the old car was burning amid the heavy vapour of petrol smoke. "Quick!" cried Olivia. "Let us get down. He may still be alive." The young man shook his head. "Not much chance, poor devil." "Did you know him?" asked the lady. "It was my husband," cried Olivia, tragic-eyed. They all plunged down the slope, the young man going straight in the ruts of the leaping car. Olivia, after a fall or two, ran gropingly to side levels, catching hold of bushes to aid her descent, and then, as she steadied herself once more on her feet, she heard a voice from behind a clump of gorse. "Just my damned luck!" Her knees shook violently. She wanted to shriek, but she controlled herself, and, staggering round the gorse bush, came upon Alexis, seated on a hummock, his head between his hands. He looked up at her stupidly, and she, with outspread fingers on panting bosom, "Thank God you're not dead." "I don't know so much about that," said he, rising to his feet. The young woman of the car, who had been following Olivia more or less in her descent, appeared from behind the bush. She too thanked God. He had been saved by a miracle. How had he escaped? "A providence which looks after idiots caused me to be hurled out of the car at the first bump. I fell into the gorse. I'm not in the least bit hurt. Please don't worry about me." "You must let us drive you home. I'll call my husband," said the young woman. "Thank you very much," said he, "but I'm perfectly sound, and I'd rather walk. But this lady seems to have had a shock, and no doubt—" The young woman, perplexed, turned to Olivia. "You said this gentleman—" For Alexis stood trim in brass-buttoned and legginged chauffeur's livery. "You said he was your husband." "A case of mistaken identity," he replied suavely. Olivia, her brain in a whirl, said nothing. The young woman advanced a few steps and cooeyed to the young man who had just reached the ravine. As he turned on her hail, she hallooed the tidings that all was well. "He'll be here in a few minutes," she said. They stood, an embarrassed trio. Alexis explained how the steering rod, which had given him trouble all day, had suddenly snapped. It had been the affair of a moment. As for the car, it was merely a kind of land ark fitted with a prehistoric internal combustion engine. Insured above its value. The proprietor would be delighted to hear the end of it. The young man joined them, out of breath. Explanations had to be given da capo. Again, Good Samaritan offers to put their two-seater at the disposal of the derelicts. With one in the back seat, they could crowd 3 in the front. They were going to Colomby, 20 miles on, but a few miles out of their way, if need be, were neither here nor there. A very charming, solicitous, well-run young couple. Olivia scarcely knew whether to shriek at them to go away, or to beg them to remain and continue to save a grotesque situation. Presently Triona repeated his thanks and declined the proffered lift. Walking would do him all the good in the world, would steady his nerves after his calamitous bump. The young man eyed him queerly. It was a strange world for a chauffeur. "But if you would take this lady," said Triona again. Olivia recovered her wits. "I will walk too, if you don't mind. I'm only a mile from home. And this gentleman is really my husband." "If we can really do nothing more." The young man raised his hat. "1,000 thanks for all your kindness," said Olivia. The very mystified young couple left them and remounted the hill. The subjects of their mystification stood for a while in silence. Presently Olivia, whose limbs not yet recovered from the shock, trembled so that her knees seemed to give her no support, said, "Don't you think we might sit down for a little?" "As you will," said Alexis, seating himself on his hummock. She cast herself down on the slope and closed her eyes for a moment. "You did that on purpose," she said at last. "You don't suppose I believe the story of the broken steering rod?" He smiled with some bitterness. Fate was for ever against him. The moment they met in this extravagant way, there started up the barrier of a lie. "I couldn't very well scare those young folks with a confession of attempted suicide, could I? After all, the naked truth may at times be positively indecent." "Then you intended to do it?" "Oh, yes," said he. "But it ended, like every other great adventure I have attempted in my life, in burlesque. I assure you that when I found myself pitched into this clump of gorse and able to pick myself up with nothing worse than a gasping for breath, the humiliation of it, I cursed the day I was born." "Why did you do it?" she asked. She had scarcely regained balance. The situation seemed unreal. But a few minutes ago he had been far from her thoughts, which were concerned with the woman to whose possibly dying bed she had been summoned, with the dreary day at Medlow now that Blaise Olifant had gone, with the still beauty of the hills and their purple sunset shadows. And now here she was, alone with him, remote from the world, conversing as dispassionately as though he had returned from the dead, as indeed he had almost returned. At her question he threw his chauffeur's cap on the grass and passed his hand over his hair. The familiar gesture, the familiar nervous brown hand, brought her a step nearer to reality. "If you can't guess, it's useless for me to tell you," he said. "You wouldn't believe me." He took out a cigarette. She noticed a trembling of the fingers. "Do you mind?" She nodded. He lit the cigarette. "I thought here, at any rate, I was hidden from you for the rest of my life. It wouldn't have been very long, anyway. I've made up my mind some day soon to set you free of me, and today or tomorrow, what did it matter? I don't ask you to believe that either. I don't see how you can believe a word I say. I gave you to understand that I was in Poland. You find me here. When did Mara tell you I was here?" Returning sanity had corrected his first mad impression. How could she be a mile from Pendish if she had not heard from Mara? But she regarded him open-mouthed. "Mara? What has Mara to do with it? Of course I had no conception you were here. I knew you were not in Poland. A man, a Pole, I forget his name, wrote to Major Olifant last year, wondering what had become of you. You had never joined him." "Boranovsky," said Triona. "That was the name. And you took it for granted I had lied to him too." Her eyes dropped beneath his half-sad, half-ironic gaze. She made a little despairing gesture. "What would you have? And Mara never told you anything about me?" "You haven't answered my question," she said, straightening herself. "Where does Mara come in?" "That's rather a long story. I should prefer her to tell it to you. Mara knows everything about me since the day after you received my last letter, over a year ago." She leaned forward, an angry spot burning on both cheeks. "Mara has been hiding you here all the time and has told me nothing about it?" "She has had her excellent reasons. She will tell you in a very few words." "She can't, at any rate not now. She's been very ill with pneumonia. They thought she was dying and sent for me. Why otherwise should I be here?" "Are you staying at Mrs. Petterland's?" "Of course." "I didn't even know Mara was in Pendish. I'm grieved to hear she's ill. I'm afraid I've neglected Mrs. Petterland of late. She was very kind to me." He paused and added with a smile, "I see Mara's loyalty. She forbade Mrs. Petterland to mention the name of the young man called Briggs. You've never heard of such a person as Pendish?" "Not a word," said Olivia. "But I shall never forgive Mara. Never, never!" she cried indignantly. "To fool me like that?" He caught sudden hope from the flash in her dark eyes. "Would you have liked to know where I was?" "I hate duplicity. I thought that Myra, at least... My God, is there anybody in the world one can trust?" Suddenly she turned on him. "What are you doing in that absurd livery?" "I've been earning my living in it since last August. I've done it before. It's an honester way than many others." "Forgive me if I don't understand," she said, still half bewildered. "You have no need to earn your living by driving a car, a common chauffeur, unless—" She checked herself with a little gasp, but his quick brain divined her impulsive thought. "Unless I'd taken to drink and gone to the bad, etc., etc.?" She interrupted him quickly. "No, I never thought that. It was a reductio ad absurdum. But on what other hypothesis? You've still your brain, your talent, your genius, your pen." "Which is mightier than the wheel," he remarked. "I don't know why you didn't go to Poland. Perhaps you'll explain. Anyhow, you didn't. You came here to the absolute quiet of the country. Why haven't you gone on writing?" "For the simple reason," said he, "that Alexis Triona and all his works are dead, washed out from the book of life. That side of me is all over and done with. You, who know everything, can't you understand?" She caught the note of truth in his words, and gradually there began to dawn on her the immensity of his artist's sacrifice. "Do you mean that you're never going to write again?" "Never," said he. "Does this look like it?" And he touched the brass buttons on his livery. She weakened through impatience at his aloofness, craving to know all that had happened to him, to get to the roots of Myra's mysterious intrigue. His fatalistic attitude was maddening. The whole crazy combination of tragedy and farce that had set them down in the gorse-enclosed hollow of the hillside, as though they were the only people on God's earth, was maddening. The brass buttons were maddening. She flung sudden arms out wide. "For God's sake, tell me everything that has happened to you." "If you believe it," said he. She sat silent for a moment, feeling as though she were under his rebuke, and gazed over the valley at the hills, black beneath the dying green and faded orange of the sunset. The thin smoke of the burned car mounted into the windless air, faint with the smell of petrol fumes and scorched woodwork. And Triona looked down too, and saw the end of the creation of his resurrection. He pointed to it. "That was one of my little dreams," he said gently. "A sort of rat trap on wheels, the most hopeless box of antiquated imbecility you can imagine. I took it into my head to recreate it. For a time I devoted my soul to it, and I made it a thing of life and speed and obedience. And there it lies, dead, a column of smoke, like all dreams, and all my deliberate fault. Every system of philosophy since the world began has overlooked the ironical symbolism of life. That's one, and my dream, smoke." She fell under the spell of his voice, although her brain revolted. Yet his note ran sincere in her heart. She knew not what to say. The sunset colours over the ridge of hills died into the arm blue of the sky. A faint breeze stirred. She shivered with cold in her thin tussore silk. He watched her, saw the shiver. "You're cold. You must be getting back." He rose. She sprang to her feet before he could help her to rise. "I'll see you to Mrs. Pettiland's." They scrambled to the high road above them and began to walk in constrained silence. Suddenly she cried, "You've hurt yourself. You're limping dreadfully. You told me you were unhurt." She clutched his arm. "You can't go on like this." "I'll go on like this," said he, thrilling under her touch, "to the day of my death. It has nothing to do with this evening's entertainment. I was smashed up by a motor lorry over a year ago, as Myra will tell you. That's what knocked me out of Poland." She echoed his words. "Smashed up by a motor lorry? It might have killed you, and I should have never known." "Myra would have told you. As a matter of fact, it very nearly did kill me." She turned her head away with a shudder. "And just now?" "I ought to have waited till I had turned the corner." He pointed out the bend a few yards in front of them. "Hell's Corner, they call it hereabouts. Then you wouldn't have seen me go over, and I might have had better luck." He saw her turn deadly white, reel, and he tried to support her, but she slipped away from him and sat by the wayside. She thought she was going to faint again. "For God's sake, don't talk like that. It's inhuman. It's unlike you. Even if you were a stranger, it would be horrible." "I'm only apologizing for my existence," he said. "Fate has been against me, but believe me, I have done my best." After a while she rose, declaring herself better, and they struck off the road down the twisting lane that led to Pendish. The air was fragrant in the dusk. "Tell me about that accident, how Mara came to know of it. I suppose you sent her word." "Perhaps when you have talked to Mara you'll credit me at least with sincere intentions. If I had informed her it would have been an indirect appeal to you." "Perhaps it would have been wiser to appeal to me direct," said Olivia tonelessly. "I'm not devoid of common humanity." "I couldn't have done that," he said gently. "I lay unconscious for weeks. When I came to my senses I found Mara had come the second morning I was in hospital. I had better begin with my meeting with the Pole Boronovsky. It's a simple matter." To him, walking with this lost wife of his dreams in the lovers' lane, the hour seemed fantastic. His voice sounded unreal in his ears. His heart, lying heavy as lead within him, was not the heart that he had thought would beat furiously at the ravishing sight of her. He told his story badly, just the salient facts, uninspired by the dramatic instinct which had made him colour so vividly the narration, a year ago, to Mrs. Pettilant of his ridiculous adventure. This he barely sketched. For truth's sake he must tell her of the robbery and account for his penniless condition. It was not himself talking. It was not Olivia to whom he talked. One stranger's personality was talking through him to another's. At the end of the tale, "You have changed greatly," she said. "That's very possible." There was a pause. He continued, "And you? Forgive me, I haven't even asked whether you are well." "Oh, I've been all right. I spent the winter abroad, and now I'm staying with Mrs. Woolcombe at the Towers. Major Olifant is away." They came up suddenly against the wicket gate of Mrs. Pettilant's garden. A light shone through the yet undrawn curtains in his old bedroom. He raised an inquiring hand. "Moira?" "Yes, I'm in Mrs. Pettilant's room in the front. She would give it up to me. I've been helping to nurse as well as I can. I've been in all day. That's why I came out for a walk this evening." "You must be tired." "I am." He waited, hoping against hope for a word revoking his sentence. None came. The steel sinew that ran through him and was answerable for all his accomplishment stiffened. He would make no appeal ad misericordiam. He had suffered enough in expiation. He had come to the end of his tether. For pity masking the last year's hatred and contempt he had no use. He opened the gate for her. She passed in, and he closed it, and the click of the latch sounded like the crack of finality. For Olivia, taken almost unawares, as for Triona. They stood for a while, the wooden barrier between them in the gathering darkness. Impulsively she exclaimed, "We can't part like this with 1,000 things unexplained." "I'm at your orders, Olivia," he replied. She caught her breath and stiffened. "We must talk tomorrow, when we have both recovered." "I'll be here any hour you name," said Alexis. Radnor and his garage could go to the devil. 9 o'clock? 9 o'clock, said he. Good night, Olivia. Wait. The memory of the scandal crashed down on her. I may as well tell you now. The night may bring you counsel. I'm in a terrible position. Wedderburn and Onslow, you remember? I do, he said. She told him rapidly of her pledge. It doesn't matter a scrap to me, but it's a damnable thing for you, said he. What answer would you make? A clean breast of everything. Could you wish me to do anything else? I don't know, she replied. Give me time to think. My time is yours, Olivia. She paused for a moment, irresolute. There was a question she wished to put, but the thought of it made her feel sick and faint again. "You'll not do anything foolish till I see you?" "Nor anything wise," said he. "I promise." Again there came between them a long, embarrassed silence. At last, "Good night," she said. "Good night, Olivia." She flung an angry hand in the darkness and slipped away into the house. End of chapter 26. Chapter 27 of The Tale of Triona by William John Locke. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 27. Mrs. Pettiland met her at the foot of the stairs. She beamed rosily beneath the gas jet. "Mara is so much better, madam, after her sleep. The doctor came while you were out. I'm to make her some chicken broth." Olivia mounted the stairs and entered the sick room. "Well, dearie?" She turned to the gaunt, waxen face on the pillow. "I'm so glad to hear the doctor's good report." She forced herself to linger, speaking the commonplaces of the sick room. Then she could bear it no longer. "I'm dead tired," she said. "I'll go to bed. Nurse ought to be here soon. Have you everything you want for the night?" Mara said in her even tones, "Have you everything you want for the night?" And at Olivia's quick glance of inquiry, "You look as if you've seen a ghost." "You have. I was afraid of it. I didn't want them to send for you, but I was too ill to stop them." Olivia could not wreak her anger yet on the frail woman, but in her heart burned a furious indignation. She controlled her voice and said as gently as she could, "Why have you left me in ignorance for the past year?" "I was biding my time," said Mara. "I was waiting for a sign and a token." "From me?" "From you, dearie. I had him here in the hollow of my hand. If you wanted him, I could have given him to you. But you didn't want him, so you said. I wasn't so sure." She stretched her thin hand on the blanket, but Olivia stood too much enwrapped in her thoughts to notice the appeal. "When I first saw him in hospital, I hoped that he would die and set you free. But when I saw him convalescent, my heart was full of pity for him, and I repented of the sin of committing murder in my heart. And when I heard from my sister-in-law that he was facing life like a brave man, I wondered whether I had been wrong, and whether you had been wrong. If I say something to you, will you be angry with me?" Olivia shrugged her shoulders. "Say anything you like." The weak, even voice went on. "If Major Olifant hadn't left us, I should have told you." Olivia leaped at the thrust, her cheeks flaming. "Mara, how dare you?" The thin lips parted in a half-smile. "Have you ever known me not to dare anything for your good?" Mara, with all the privileges of illness, had her at a disadvantage. Olivia was silenced. She unpinned her hat and threw it on a chair and sat by the bedside. "I see that you acted for the best, Mara." Not only her cheeks, but her body flamed at what seemed now the humiliating illusion. Mara was fully aware, if not of the actual kiss, oh no, nothing horrible of servants' espionage of Mara, at any rate of the emotionality in which it had culminated. On her part, sex, sense, the unexpected thrill, the elemental between man and woman, the hunger for she knew not what, but superficial, tearing at her nerves, but never, oh never, touching the bedrock of her spiritual being. A great passionate love for Blaise, she knew, Mara, with her direct vision, would have understood. For the assurance of her life's happiness, Mara would have sacrificed her hope of eternal salvation. But the worn woman, who had had but 1 week's great fulfilment of love in her life, knew what love meant, and she had sounded the shallows of her pitiful love, if love it could be called, for Blaise Olifant, and now, in her sad, fatalistic way, she showed her the poor markings of the lead. "So you have seen him?" asked Mara quietly. "Yes, I've seen him. God knows how you know." "Well?" Her overstrained soul gave way. She broke into uncontrollable crying and sobbing, her little dark head on the blanket by Mara's side, and after a little came incoherent words. "I've lost him. He doesn't care for me any more. He hates me. He tried to kill himself when he saw me. He was driving a car and put it over a precipice. Thank God, A miracle. He wasn't hurt, but he might have killed himself. He meant to. And it's all your fault. All your fault. If only you had told me." Mara put her thin hand on the dear dark hair and caressed it till the paroxysm was over. "I loved a thing that was scarcely a man till the day of his death, for I have memories, dearie, of him when he was a man to be loved. You've got a living man for a husband, and you love yours as much as I loved mine, and he's a living and suffering man. Go to him." Her hand still played feebly caressing the black mass of her hair. "Fate has brought you together again. He's your man, whom you vowed to help in sickness or in health. I kept mine in sickness. Thank God, your man's sickness is nothing like mine. Go to him, dearie. Humble yourself if need be. I've been very ill. I thought and thought and thought of an idea that illness clears one's brain, and all my thoughts have been for you. For me there's nothing left. I've thought of him and you. I've thought of what he has done and what you have done, and with all his faults he's a bigger human being than you are, dearie. Go to him." Olivia raised a tragic face. "How can I? He doesn't want me." "A man doesn't try to kill himself for a woman he doesn't want. You'd better go to him." And Olivia went. She slipped out of the house at 11 o'clock, after a couple of hours of wrestling with ugly and vain devils. Who was she, after all? What had she done to add a grain to the world's achievement? What had she found in her adventure into the world that had been worth the having, save the love of the man that was her husband? Many phases of existence had passed procession-wise through her life, all hollows and shams. The Lydian Galley, with its Mervenas and Bobby Quintons, the mad Blenkerans, the gentle, uninspiring circle of little Janet Phillimore, the literary and artistic society for the few months of Alexis's lionization, pleasant but superficial, always leaving her with the sense of having fallen far short of a communion that might have been. Nothing satisfying but the needs and the childish wants and the work and the uplifting spirit of the one man. And after the great parting, what had there been? Her life in Medlow, devoid of all meaning, a 6 months' travel, a feeling of self to no purpose, an existence of negativity. Blaise Olifant. She flamed, conscious of one thing at last positive, and positive for ill. She had played, almost deliberately, with fire. Otherwise, why had she gone back to Medlow? She had brought unhappiness to a very noble gentleman. It had been in his power as a man to sweep her off her feet in a weak hour of clamouring sex. He had spared her, and she now was unutterably grateful. For she had never loved him. She could not love him. His long, straight nose. She grew half hysterical. Even when he had kissed her, she had been conscious of that long, straight nose. She withered at the thought. She slipped out of the house into the soft night. Pendish, with its double line of low, whitewashed, thatched cottages, one a deep shadow, the other clear in the moonlight, lay as still as a ghostly village of the Middle Ages. The echo of her light footsteps frightened her. Surely windows would fly open and heads peer out, challenging the disturber of peace. She was going to him. Why, she scarcely knew. Perhaps through obedience to Mara. Mara's bloodless lips, working in the waxen, immobile face, lit, if dull glimmer could be called light, by the cold, china-blue eyes, had uttered words little less than oracular. Mara had been waiting for a sign or a token from her that had never come. She walked through the splendid silence of the country road, beneath the radiance of a moon above the hills, illuminating a mystery of upland and vale, shrouded in the vaporous garments of the land asleep. Hurrying along the white ribbon of road, she was but a little dark dot on the surface of a serenely scornful universe. She was going to him. He was her man. All that she knew of the meaning of existence came from him. Moonlight and starlight, and the mystery of the night shimmering through its veil of enchantment, faded from her eyes. She felt nervous arms around her and kisses on her lips, and she heard him speaking the winged words of imagination, lifting her into his world of genius. A man doesn't try to kill himself for a woman he doesn't want. So spake Mara. Olivia walked, the dull tones in which the words were uttered thudding in her ears. It was her one hope of salvation. Kill himself? This was not a falsehood. She had seen the act with her own horror-stricken eyes. She remembered a phrase of Blaise Olifant's. He's been blackmailed by one lie. She realized with sudden shock her insignificant loneliness in the midst of this vast moonlit silence of the earth. In presence of the immensities she was of no account. For the first time she became aware of her own failure. She had been weighed in the balance of her love for her husband, and had been found wanting. In the hour of his bitter trial she had failed him. In the hour when a word of love, of understanding, which meant forgiveness, would have saved him, she had put him from her. She had lived on her own little vanities without thought of the man's torture. She had failed him then. She had failed him today. A man doesn't try to kill himself for a woman he doesn't want. She strode on, her cheeks burning. All that of extravagance which he had done this past year had been for her sake. For all wrong he had done her, he had sought the final expiation in death. She had failed him again in this supreme crisis. She had whined to Mara that he no longer loved her, and she had not given him that which even Mara was waiting for, a sign and a token. She was going to him, nearing him. Already she entered the straggling end of Fanstead. How would he receive her? If he cast her off, she would perish in self-contempt. She went on. An unsuspecting Mrs. Pettiland had told her, in answer to a question which she strove to keep casual, the whereabouts of the Quantock garage. The sign above an open gateway broke suddenly on her vision. She entered a silent courtyard. A light was burning in a loft above a closed garage, and a wooden flight of steps ran up to it. The door was open, and on the threshold sat a man, his feet on the top stair, his head buried in his hands. She advanced, her heart in her mouth. The moon shone full on him. She uttered a little whispering cry. "Alexis!" He started to his feet, gazed at her for a breathless second, and scrambled with grotesque speed down the rickety staircase, and caught her in his arms. She mounted the stairs to his loft, furnished with pallet bed and camp washing apparatus, a wooden chair, a table bearing unsightly remains of crust and cheese, and littered with books in corners and on the uncarpeted floor. All her remorse and pity and love gushed over him, over the misery of the life to which she had condemned him by her littleness of soul and her hardness of heart. She did not spare herself, but of this profanity he would hear nothing. She had come to him. She had forgiven him. The celestial hierarchy would be darkened by the presence of one so radiantly angelic. She clutched him tight to her. "Oh, my God, if you had been killed!" Exultant, he cried in his old way, "Nothing could kill me, for I was born for your love." They talked through the night into the sweet-scented June dawn. They would face the world fiercely together. First the Onslow and Wedderburn challenge to be taken up. She would stand by his side through all the obloquy. That was the newer meaning of her life. If they were outcasts, what did it matter? They could not be other than splendidly outcast. He responded in his eager way to her enthusiasm. Magna est veritas et praevalebit. With never a shadow between them, what ecstasy would be existence? They crept downstairs like children into the summer morning. But as they had planned, so did it not turn out. Rowington gave news that Onslow and Wedderburn had dropped the question. Why revive dead controversy? But Triona and Olivia insisted. The letter on the origin of Through Blood and Snow, signed John Briggs, appeared in the Times. A few references to it appeared in the next weekly press, but that was all. No one was interested. Through Blood and Snow was forgotten. The events of 1917 in Russia were ancient history. As well worry over fresh scandals concerning Catherine the Great. What did the reading world care what Alexis Triona's real name was, or how he had obtained the material for his brilliant book? This summary of the effect of attempted literary and social suicide was put clearly before them in a long letter from Rowington a month or so afterwards. "But we want another novel from Alexis Triona. When are we going to get it?" They had stayed on indefinitely at Pendish, ostensibly awaiting Mara's complete convalescence, and, incidentally, as they told themselves, having their second honeymoon. At first she took it for granted that he would resign his post at the Quantock garage. "I'm not going to begin life again by breaking my word," said he. "I promised to see him over his honeymoon." "That's a bit mad and quixotic," said Olivia. "So's all that's worth having in life, my dear," said he. So she had settled down for the time with her chauffeur husband, and meanwhile had been feeding him into health. They read the letter together. "It's no use," wrote Rowington, "to start again under the Briggs name. You've told the world that Triona is a pseudonym. Alexis Triona means something. John Briggs doesn't." "He's quite right," said Olivia. "As you will," he said. "I give in. But you can't say I've not done my very best to kill Alexis Triona." "And you can't. Fate again. And, Alexis dear, I never knew John Briggs." They were in the sea-haunted parlour. After a while he took up the pink conch shell and fingered it lovingly. Then, with a laugh, he put it to her ear. "What does it say?" She listened a while, handed him back the shell, and, looking up at him out of her dark eyes, laughed the laugh of deep happiness. "I'll go with you, dear, to any South Sea island you like." "Will you?" he cried. "We'll go, and I'll write a novel full of the beauty of God's universe, and you." Mara came in to lay the luncheon table. Olivia leaped up and threw her arms around the thin shoulders. "Mara, dear, you'll have to pack up quick. We're going to Honolulu tomorrow." "You must make it the day after," said Mara. "The laundry doesn't come till tomorrow night." End of chapter 27. End of The Tale of Triona by William John Locke.